Welcome, weary traveller, to a tale of laughter echoing through ancient corridors and mischief woven into the very stones of Hogwarts. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary journey of Fred and George Weasley, twin souls born on April Fool's Day, destined to bring light to the darkest of times through their unwavering bond and infectious joy. As you settle into your cozy chamber, let these words carry you through the lives of perhaps the most beloved pranksters who ever lived. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of brotherly devotion, where every laugh was shared and every adventure was doubled, painting the wizarding world in colours of pure, unbridled magic. In the rolling hills of Devon, where ancient magic flows through hedgerow and stream, there stood a house that defied every convention of architectural sensibility, while embracing something far more important, the chaotic warmth of a family bound by love rather than logic. The Burrow, as it was affectionately known, rose from the earth like a joyful exclamation mark against the pastoral landscape, its rooms stacked upon one another with the haphazard enthusiasm of children building with blocks, held together by magic and an unshakable faith that home was wherever the Weasleys gathered to laugh, argue, and love with equal fervour. It was into this wonderfully mad household that Frederick Gideon Weasley and George Fabian Weasley entered the world on the first day of April, 1978, their birth timing so perfect for future mischief makers that even the universe seemed to be in on the joke. Fred emerged first, as if unwilling to let his brother claim the honour of being the elder twin, followed mere minutes later by George, who would spend the rest of his life catching up to and keeping pace with his other half in adventures both magnificent and moderately catastrophic. The midwife who delivered them would later swear that the babies had exchanged glances before either had properly opened their eyes, as if they were already communicating in the mysterious language that twins sometimes develop, planning schemes that would terrorize and delight their family for decades to come. Arthur Weasley, their father, held both boys at once and marveled at how perfectly they fit together, two pieces of the same puzzle that would never be quite complete when separated. Molly Weasley, exhausted but triumphant after bringing her fourth and fifth children into the world, looked upon her newest sons with the mixture of fierce love and prophetic dread that mothers of twins learn to cultivate. She had already survived the energetic chaos of Bill, the adventurous spirit of Charlie, and the studious intensity of Percy, but something in the way these two babies looked at each other suggested that her previous parenting experiences had been merely preparation for the delightful mayhem that was about to unfold. The Burrow itself seemed to expand to accommodate its new residents, rooms rearranging themselves with the casual impossibility that characterized the Weasley home. A nursery appeared on the second floor, wedged between Percy's orderly bedroom and what would eventually become Ron's domain, as if the house understood that these twins would need a space that could contain their combined energy without completely destroying the family's peace of mind. From their earliest days, Fred and George displayed the kind of synchronized behavior that made visitors wonder if they were witnessing some form of accidental magic, or simply the natural result of two souls who had chosen to inhabit separate bodies while maintaining a single consciousness. They crawled in formation, discovered walking at precisely the same moment, and developed a form of communication that consisted largely of meaningful glances and shared laughter that seemed to arise from jokes that only they understood. Their older brothers watched this development with varying degrees of fascination and concern. Bill, nearly 8 years their senior, treated them with the benevolent amusement of someone old enough to appreciate the comedy without being directly responsible for managing it. Charlie, 6 years older, recognized kindred spirits in the twins' boundless energy and became their first instructor in the fine art of flying, though he would later claim that teaching them to handle broomsticks was like giving dragons lessons in fire breathing, technically unnecessary but undeniably entertaining. Percy, only 2 years older but already displaying the serious demeanor that would define his character, viewed his twin brothers with the mixture of affection and exasperation that would characterize their relationship for years to come. He loved them deeply, but couldn't understand why they seemed incapable of approaching any situation with the gravity it deserved, whether that situation was breakfast, bedtime, or the careful organization of his collection of cauldron bottoms. The financial realities of raising 5 children on a ministry salary meant that Fred and George's early years were marked by the creative resourcefulness that characterized the entire Weasley household. Their clothes were hand-me-downs from their older brothers, passed down through a complex system that Molly managed with military precision, ensuring that each garment served maximum duty before being relegated to the rag pile or transformed into something entirely different through the magic of desperate domestic transfiguration. But if their material possessions were limited, their wealth in love and laughter was beyond measure. The Burrow rang constantly with the sounds of childhood, feet thundering up and down the impossible staircases, voices raised in argument or song, the crash of objects being accidentally destroyed and then hastily repaired before Molly could investigate the source of the noise. Into this symphony of family chaos, Fred and George added their own distinctive harmonies, creating a musical backdrop to their early years that would echo in their memories long after they had left home to seek their fortunes in the wider wizarding world. Their shared bedroom on the 2nd floor became the first laboratory for experiments that would eventually revolutionize the field of magical practical jokes. Even as toddlers, they displayed an uncanny ability to collaborate on projects that no single child could have conceived or executed, working together with the kind of wordless coordination that made their parents wonder if they were witnessing the development of some new form of magic, or simply the natural result of 2 minds that operated on identical wavelengths. The explosions that would later become their trademark began early, though in those days they were more accidental than intentional. Fred would reach for something on a high shelf, George would steady his brother's chair, and somehow the combination of their efforts would result in a cascade of books, toys, and miscellaneous magical objects that would rain down upon their room with percussive enthusiasm. Molly learned to distinguish between the sounds of ordinary childhood mayhem and the particular quality of disaster that indicated her twins were once again defying the basic laws of magical physics through sheer force of combined will. Arthur, returning home each evening from his work in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, would climb the stairs to the twins' room and survey the wreckage with the philosophical acceptance of a man who understood that some forces of nature were meant to be channeled rather than contained. He would help them clean up their various disasters while listening to their breathless explanations of what they had been trying to accomplish, recognizing in their earnest enthusiasm the same curiosity about the world that drove his own fascination with the ingenious inventions of non-magical people. The first signs of their future career path appeared when Fred was 5 years old and George was trailing close behind in both age and mischievous intent. Ron, their younger brother, who had recently mastered the art of walking with minimal catastrophic results, had accidentally broken his toy broomstick during one of his enthusiastic attempts to emulate his older brother's flying demonstrations. The destruction of the beloved toy had resulted in tears of such magnitude that the entire household was mobilized to console the distraught toddler. Fred, observing his little brother's distress with the calculating eyes of someone already learning to identify opportunities for creative problem-solving, decided that the situation called for dramatic action. While the rest of the family was focused on locating a suitable replacement toy, or perhaps repairing the broken broomstick through conventional magical means, Fred slipped away to Ron's room and retrieved his brother's favorite teddy bear, a well-worn brown creature that had provided comfort through numerous childhood crises. The transformation that Fred performed was technically impressive for a child who wouldn't receive formal magical education for several more years, but the psychological impact was perhaps more significant than the magical achievement itself. The teddy bear, which had been soft and cuddly and everything that a comfort object should be, suddenly sprouted 8 legs, developed a covering of coarse black hair, and began moving with the distinctly unsettling gait of a creature that belonged in nightmares rather than nurseries. Ron's reaction to discovering that his beloved teddy bear had become an enormous spider was immediate and would prove to be permanent. The screams that echoed through the Burrow that afternoon were so intense that neighbors half a mile away inquired about the family's well-being, and Arthur had to leave work early to deal with the crisis that had transformed his youngest son's bedroom into what appeared to be a scene from his worst fears. The incident established several important precedents that would define Fred and George's relationship with their family for years to come. First, it demonstrated that their magical abilities, while impressive, were not always accompanied by mature judgment about appropriate targets for their experiments. Second, it revealed their capacity for creative revenge that was both disproportionate to the original offense and sufficiently memorable to serve as a deterrent against future transgressions. Most importantly, it showed that their actions, while often intended as harmless pranks, could have consequences that extended far beyond their original intentions. Ron's arachnophobia, which would plague him throughout his life and prove to be a significant obstacle during various adventures at Hogwarts, could be traced directly to that afternoon when his 5-year-old brother decided that spider transformation was an appropriate response to toy destruction. The irony was not lost on Fred and George in later years, when they would watch their younger brother face magical spiders with the kind of paralyzing terror that made dangerous situations even more perilous than they needed to be. Molly's response to the teddy bear incident was swift and comprehensive, involving punishments that were memorable enough to discourage immediate repetition, while being educational enough to help the twins understand why their actions had been problematic. But even as she scolded them for their thoughtlessness and insisted on proper apologies to their traumatized younger brother, she couldn't entirely suppress her amazement at the sophistication of magic that Fred had performed without formal training or adult supervision. The twins' next major adventure in unsupervised magical experimentation involved an attempt to convince 5-year-old Ron to participate in what they assured him was a perfectly harmless magical ceremony. The unbreakable vow, as they had learned from overhearing adult conversations about serious magical commitments, seemed like an exciting way to ensure that their younger brother would honor his promises about sharing sweets, completing assigned chores, and refraining from telling their parents about various minor infractions that might result in restrictions on their recreational activities. The magical theory behind their plan was sound, if incomplete. They understood that the unbreakable vow created a binding magical contract between participants, enforced by consequences serious enough to ensure compliance with whatever terms were agreed upon. What they failed to appreciate, with the incomplete knowledge that characterizes most childhood schemes, was that the consequences of breaking such a vow extended beyond simple punishment to include immediate and permanent death for anyone who violated their sworn commitment. Arthur's intervention in this particular experiment was more dramatic than his usual measured responses to their creative misadventures. The discovery of his 3 youngest sons engaged in ritual magic that could have resulted in Ron's death if the vow had been completed and subsequently broken produced a reaction that the twins would later describe as the only time they had ever seen their father display the kind of terrifying, parental authority that their mother wielded as a matter of course. The spanking that followed was memorable not for its physical impact, which was minimal given Arthur's gentle nature, but for its rarity in a household where discipline was usually administered through stern lectures and temporary restrictions on privileges. Fred would joke years later that his left buttock had never been quite the same since that afternoon. But the real lesson they absorbed was that some forms of magic carried consequences too serious for experimental purposes, regardless of how interesting the theoretical applications might appear to curious children. The incident also provided their first real understanding of mortality and the fragility of the bonds that held their family together. The sight of their normally calm and reasonable father, rendered speechless with fear at the thought of losing one of his children, taught them that their actions could have consequences that extended far beyond temporary inconvenience or embarrassment. It was a sobering lesson for children who had previously viewed the world as an endless source of entertainment and experimental opportunities. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Unbreakable Vow incident was the way it deepened the twins' understanding of their responsibility toward their younger siblings. The terror in Ron's eyes when Arthur had explained what could have happened if they had completed their magical experiment stayed with Fred and George long after the immediate consequences had been forgotten. They began to understand that their position as older brothers came with obligations that extended beyond simple entertainment and occasional protection from external threats. This growing awareness of responsibility manifested in more thoughtful approaches to their pranks, though their definition of thoughtfulness remained distinctly different from what their parents might have preferred. The acid pop incident, which occurred several months later, demonstrated both their continued enthusiasm for magical experimentation and their evolving understanding of appropriate targets for their creative endeavors. The sweet that Fred offered to 7-year-old Ron was one of his own creation, a variation on commercially available magical candy that he had enhanced through techniques that he refused to explain even under intense interrogation from their mother. The theoretical purpose of the enhancement was to intensify the tingling sensation that made acid pops popular among children who enjoyed mild discomfort as entertainment, but the practical result was a confection that could burn a hole through a human tongue with alarming efficiency. The emergency trip to Street Mungo's that followed Ron's consumption of the experimental candy was Fred and George's first real introduction to the serious consequences that could result from magical accidents. Watching their little brother undergo healing procedures that were both painful and frightening, while their parents alternated between fury and terror, taught them that their experiments carried risks that extended beyond their own safety, to encompass everyone who trusted them enough to accept their creations. Molly's response to the acid pop incident was perhaps more educational than any formal punishment could have been. Instead of simply restricting the twins' access to magical ingredients or forbidding future experiments, she required them to spend the following week helping her with all aspects of Ron's care, while his tongue healed from the damage that Fred's candy had inflicted. They had to help feed him soft foods, assist with the application of healing potions, and witness firsthand the pain and frustration that their thoughtless prank had caused. The experience of caring for their injured brother while dealing with the guilt of having caused his suffering marked another important step in Fred and George's emotional development. They learned that magic powerful enough to create genuine entertainment was also powerful enough to cause genuine harm, and that the line between acceptable mischief and dangerous recklessness was often thinner than they had realized. The lesson would influence their approach to magical experimentation for the rest of their lives, though it would never entirely eliminate their willingness to test the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The twins' relationship with the magical creatures that inhabited the grounds around the Burrow provided another outlet for their boundless curiosity and energy. The garden gnomes that infested their mother's vegetable patches were treated less like pest problems and more like opportunities for advanced education in creative problem-solving. Though Molly's definition of appropriate gnome management differed significantly from the techniques that Fred and George preferred to employ. Denoming the garden was a regular chore assigned to all the Weasley children old enough to handle the physical demands of gnome removal. But Fred and George approached the task with the kind of innovative enthusiasm that transformed routine maintenance into experimental research. Instead of simply grabbing the gnomes and throwing them as far as possible beyond the garden boundaries, which was the traditional method recommended by their parents, they developed elaborate techniques designed to maximize both efficiency and entertainment value. Their most successful innovation involved teaching the gnomes an extensive vocabulary of colorful language that they had acquired through careful observation of their uncles during particularly heated discussions about Quidditch teams and ministry policies. The result was a garden populated by small, angry creatures who could express their displeasure at being disturbed in terms that would have made professional sailors proud of their linguistic creativity. The entertainment value of hearing gnomes swear with impressive fluency was undeniable, but the educational implications became problematic when visiting relatives were treated to botanical tours that included unexpectedly explicit commentary from the plant life. Arthur's attempts to explain to his horrified sister-in-law that the garden gnomes had developed their vocabularies through no fault of the family's moral instruction were complicated by Fred and George's obvious pride in their achievement and their willingness to demonstrate the extent of their success whenever they had an appreciative audience. Family gatherings at the Burrow took on additional complexity as Fred and George's reputation for creative mischief began to precede them into situations where their relatives were prepared for defensive action rather than simple enjoyment of their company. Aunt Muriel, Arthur's elderly and formidable aunt whose visits were endured rather than anticipated even under the best circumstances, became an increasingly reluctant participant in Weasley family celebrations after several encounters with the twins' experimental approach to hospitality. The dung bomb incident that ended Aunt Muriel's Christmas visits was the culmination of years of escalating conflict between the twins' irrepressible need to enliven boring adult conversations and their aunt's equally firm conviction that children should be seen, briefly, and heard not at all during formal family gatherings. The strategic placement of the aromatic device under her chair during Christmas dinner represented months of careful planning and precise timing, executed with the kind of military precision that would have impressed professional strategists. The explosion of noxious fumes that erupted just as Aunt Muriel was launching into her annual lecture about the declining standards of modern parenting was perfectly timed for maximum impact and minimum opportunity for graceful recovery. The elderly woman's dignified retreat from the dining room was somewhat compromised by the lingering cloud of offensive odors that seemed to follow her despite her best efforts to maintain the kind of regal bearing that had intimidated 3 generations of Weasley children. Arthur's conviction that the twins had permanently damaged their inheritance prospects through this particular prank proved to be accurate, though Fred and George would later argue that being written out of Aunt Muriel's will was a small price to pay for the expression of shocked outrage that had crossed their great-aunt's face in the moment before she realized what had happened. The memory of that Christmas dinner would sustain them through many subsequent lectures about appropriate behavior during family gatherings. But the laughter that characterized most of their childhood was balanced by experiences that introduced them to the darker realities of the magical world beyond their protected home. The deaths of their uncles Fabian and Gideon Pruitt, Molly's brothers who had been killed fighting Death Eaters during the First War against Voldemort, cast shadows over the Burrow that even Fred and George's irrepressible spirits couldn't entirely dispel. The funeral services for the Pruitt brothers were the first formal occasions where Fred and George encountered death as something more than an abstract concept, discussed in hushed tones by adults who thought children weren't listening. Seeing their mother's grief, witnessing their father's attempts to provide comfort for sorrows that couldn't be easily healed, and observing the tears of relatives who had always seemed invulnerable, gave the twins their first real understanding of mortality and the fragility of the happiness they had always taken for granted. Uncle Bilius's death which occurred after he claimed to have seen the Grim, added another layer of complexity to their growing awareness of the magical world's dangers. The family's reaction to his passing was complicated by the widespread belief that seeing the spectral dog was an omen of impending death, creating discussions about fate and prophecy that were far removed from the comfortable certainties of their daily life at the Burrow. These experiences with loss and grief helped Fred and George develop a more nuanced understanding of their role as entertainers within their family circle. They learned that laughter could be a form of healing, that well-timed jokes could provide relief from sorrows that threatened to overwhelm their loved ones, but also that some situations required sensitivity rather than humor. The balance between appropriate levity and respectful seriousness was a skill they would continue to develop throughout their lives, though their interpretation of appropriateness would remain distinctly different from conventional social expectations. Their education in flying and Quidditch began early under the tutelage of Bill and Charlie, whose patience with their younger brother's enthusiasm was matched only by their determination to ensure that the twins developed proper technique along with their natural athleticism. The backyard behind the Burrow became their training ground, marked by goalposts that Arthur had constructed with more enthusiasm than engineering expertise, and boundary lines that shifted according to the availability of garden space, not currently occupied by Molly's vegetables or various magical creatures seeking temporary shelter. The competitive spirit that would later make Fred and George formidable beaters was evident from their first attempts to master broomstick flying. They pushed each other to greater heights, faster speeds, and more daring maneuvers with the kind of sibling rivalry that was both motivating and occasionally dangerous. Their natural coordination, enhanced by their intuitive understanding of each other's intentions and capabilities, made them effective partners in aerial games that required split-second timing and absolute trust. Charlie's instruction in Quidditch strategy provided them with tactical knowledge that would serve them well during their Hogwarts careers, but more importantly, it taught them how individual excellence could be enhanced through teamwork and mutual support. The lessons they learned about reading the game, anticipating opponents' moves, and coordinating their actions for maximum effectiveness would later be applied to endeavors far removed from athletic competition, though the same principles of partnership and communication would remain central to their approach to every challenge they encountered together. As their 11th birthday approached, bringing with it the promise of Hogwarts letters and formal magical education, Fred and George found themselves balancing excitement about the adventures that lay ahead with reluctance to leave the familiar comforts of home and family. The Burrow had been their entire world for 11 years, providing safety and love and unlimited opportunities for experimentation and growth. But they were beginning to understand that their futures lay beyond the boundaries of their family's protection. The anticipation of Hogwarts created a mixture of emotions that was characteristic of the twins' approach to major life transitions. They were eager to explore the castle they had heard so much about from Bill and Charlie, excited to learn new forms of magic that would expand their creative possibilities, and curious about the classmates who would become their companions in adventures that would make their childhood pranks seem tame by comparison. But they were also apprehensive about leaving their younger siblings, particularly Ron and Ginny, who would remain at home for several more years before joining them at school. The thought of being separated from their family for months at a time was mitigated by the knowledge that they would have each other as companions and conspirators in whatever challenges and opportunities awaited them at Hogwarts. Their partnership, forged through 11 years of shared adventures and mutual support, would be their anchor in the unfamiliar environment of formal education, providing continuity and comfort as they adapted to life beyond the loving chaos of the Burrow. The crimson steam that billowed from the Hogwarts Express on that first September morning seemed to carry with it all the dreams and anxieties of a lifetime. wrapping the platform in clouds that tasted of adventure and possibility. King's Cross Station had never seen such a gathering of extraordinary individuals attempting to appear ordinary. Witches and wizards dressed in their best approximations of Muggle clothing, while their children clutched owl cages and dragged trunks that contained wonders beyond the imagination of the non-magical travelers who hurried past without a second glance. Fred and George Weasley stood at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, their matching trunks resting at their feet, and their eyes bright with the kind of anticipation that comes from 11 years of hearing stories about the school that awaited them. The Hogwarts letters that had arrived that July had been read and reread until the parchment was soft with handling, each word memorized and discussed until even Molly had grown tired of their endless questions about what their first year would bring. The journey to the station had been an adventure in itself, with Arthur borrowing a ministry car that was larger on the inside than its exterior suggested, though the twins had been too excited to pay much attention to the spatial modifications that made it possible for the entire family to travel together in comfort. Their trunks had been packed and repacked with the meticulous care that their mother brought to all important occasions, each item selected for its potential usefulness during their months away from home. Molly had spent the previous evening going through their belongings one final time, checking that they had sufficient underwear and socks, adequate supplies of quills and parchment, and the proper textbooks for their first-year courses. But even as she fussed over these practical details, Fred and George could see the mixture of pride and apprehension in her eyes, as she contemplated sending 2 more of her children into the wider magical world, where her protection could not follow them. The barrier that separated the Muggle world from platform 9 3/4 was invisible to non-magical eyes, but Fred and George had been prepared for this moment by years of stories from Bill and Charlie about the proper technique for passing through solid walls without injury or embarrassment. The key, they had been told, was to approach with confidence rather than hesitation, trusting in the magic that would allow them passage while maintaining the kind of casual demeanor that wouldn't attract unwanted attention from curious muggles. Percy had already demonstrated the procedure with the kind of theatrical precision that characterized his approach to most activities, disappearing through the barrier with a flourish that suggested he was performing for an audience rather than simply catching a train to school. His success had been reassuring to Fred and George, who had occasionally wondered if their older brother's serious nature might somehow prevent the magic from working properly, though they kept such concerns to themselves out of consideration for family harmony. Their own passage through the barrier was accomplished with the casual ease that would characterize their entire relationship with magic, stepping forward together in the synchronized movement that had become second nature after 11 years of shared adventures. The sensation of walking through solid stone was brief and not unpleasant, like passing through cool water that offered no resistance to their movement. And then they were standing on platform 9 3/4 with their first glimpse of the world they were about to enter. The Hogwarts Express was magnificent in a way that exceeded even the enthusiastic descriptions they had heard from their older brothers, stretching along the platform like a scarlet dragon that breathed steam instead of fire. Students were loading their belongings into the compartments with the efficiency that comes from long practice, though Fred and George could identify the first years by their wide-eyed wonder and their tendency to stand motionless while they absorbed the spectacle around them. The platform itself was a study in controlled chaos, with families saying their farewells while cats yowled from their carriers and owls hooted their displeasure at being confined during what promised to be a lengthy journey. The air was filled with the sounds of reunion as older students encountered friends they hadn't seen since the previous term, their voices creating a symphony of excitement that made Fred and George's hearts race with anticipation of the friendships they would form and the adventures they would share. But before they could board the train and begin their journey toward their new life, there was the matter of saying goodbye to their family, a process that was complicated by the fact that goodbyes had never been particularly easy for the Weasleys, who preferred hellos and see you laters to anything that sounded like permanent separation. Molly gathered her twins into a fierce embrace that conveyed all the love and worry and pride that she couldn't express in words, while Arthur shook their hands with the formal dignity that he reserved for occasions of particular importance. Ron and Ginny, who would remain at home for 2 more years before joining their brothers at Hogwarts, tried to hide their envious disappointment behind brave smiles and cheerful waves, though Fred and George could see the longing in their eyes as they watched the older children prepare for adventures that seemed impossibly exciting and distant. The twins made a solemn promise to write regularly and to send their younger siblings detailed accounts of everything they experienced, a commitment they intended to honor despite their general tendency to forget about correspondence once they became absorbed in more immediate concerns. The loading of their trunks onto the train provided a welcome distraction from the emotional complexity of family farewells, though even this practical task was complicated by the magical properties of some of their belongings and the tendency of their possessions to develop opinions about proper storage procedures. Their owl, a small brown creature named Hermes that Bill had given them as a shared pet, expressed his disapproval of train travel through a series of indignant hoots that suggested he would prefer to fly to Hogwarts independently rather than endure the indignity of being transported like ordinary luggage. The compartment they selected was located roughly in the middle of the train, positioned strategically to provide easy access to both ends of the express, while offering sufficient privacy for the kind of conversations that first-year students needed to have about their expectations and anxieties regarding the school experience that awaited them. The seats were upholstered in comfortable fabric that showed the wear of decades of use by generations of Hogwarts students, each mark and stain representing a story of its own about the adventures and misadventures that were part of the traditional journey to school. Their fellow passengers were a mixture of ages and backgrounds, from nervous first years like themselves to sophisticated 7th-year students who carried themselves with the confident bearing of young adults who had mastered the complexities of magical education and were approaching their final year with appropriate gravity. The older students served as living proof that survival of Hogwarts was not only possible but could result in the kind of competence and self-assurance that Fred and George hoped to develop during their own 7 years at the school. The train's departure from King's Cross was marked by a whistle that seemed to echo with centuries of tradition, carrying away each new generation of witches and wizards toward their destiny, while their families watched from the platform until the last car disappeared around the curve of the tracks. Fred and George pressed their faces to the window and waved until they could no longer see the tiny figures of their parents and siblings, then settled back into their seats to begin the process of adjusting to their new status as Hogwarts students. The journey to Scotland provided their first real opportunity to interact with their future classmates without the protective presence of their family, though their natural confidence and genuine curiosity about other people made the transition from family conversation to social interaction remarkably smooth. They discovered that their reputation as the Weasley twins had preceded them to some extent, as several older students recognized their family name and expressed appreciation for the entertainment that Bill and Charlie had provided during their own school careers. But it was their meeting with Lee Jordan that would prove to be the most significant encounter of that first train ride, establishing a friendship that would endure throughout their Hogwarts years and beyond. Lee, a fellow first year with skin the color of rich chocolate and dreadlocks that he wore with casual pride, possessed the kind of irreverent humor and creative intelligence that complemented Fred and George's own personalities perfectly, as if he had been specifically designed to complete their partnership and transform it into a triumvirate of mischief. The conversation that developed between the three boys during that first journey revealed common interests that extended far beyond simple appreciation for pranks and jokes, encompassing a shared fascination with the theoretical possibilities of magic and a mutual determination to explore every aspect of Hogwarts life with the thoroughness that important discoveries deserved. Lee's knowledge of magical theory, gained through extensive reading and natural intellectual curiosity, balanced Fred and George's practical experience with magic and their intuitive understanding of how spells and charms could be modified for purposes their creators had never intended. The sorting hat ceremony that awaited them at journey's end was discussed with the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that characterized most first-year conversations about the process that would determine their dormitory, assignments, and social affiliations for the next 7 years. Fred and George had grown up assuming they would be sorted into Gryffindor like their older brothers, but the stories they had heard about the hat's ability to see into students' hearts and minds made them wonder if their assumptions about their own characters were accurate. The feast that followed the sorting ceremony was their first taste of Hogwarts hospitality, a meal that exceeded even Molly's generous portions and included dishes that had been prepared with the kind of magical enhancement that made ordinary food transcendent. The Great Hall itself was a marvel of architectural impossibility, its ceiling charmed to reflect the night sky while thousands of candles floated overhead without any visible means of support, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously intimate and grand. But even as they marveled at their surroundings and enjoyed the company of their new housemates, Fred and George found themselves studying the castle's layout with the systematic attention to detail that would characterize their approach to exploration and discovery throughout their school years. They noted the positions of doors and windows, the arrangement of the house tables, the location of the staff table, and the various entrances and exits that might prove useful during future adventures that would require discretionary movement through the castle's public spaces. The dormitory that would be their home for the next 7 years was located in Gryffindor Tower, reached by a spiral staircase that seemed designed to test the determination of students who were too tired or too lazy to make the climb with proper enthusiasm. The circular room they shared with their fellow first-year boys was furnished with 4 poster beds draped in scarlet curtains, each one providing a private space within the communal living arrangement that would allow them to maintain some degree of personal privacy despite the close quarters. Their trunk unpacking was accomplished with the kind of systematic efficiency that their mother had tried to instill in them, though their definition of organization remained distinctly different from conventional approaches to storage and arrangement. Clothes were distributed between drawers and the floor, according to principles that made sense to them, but might have puzzled outside observers, while their books and school supplies were arranged with the careful attention to accessibility that suggested they were already planning for the kind of studying that would be required to master their coursework. The other boys in their dormitory were a diverse group, representing different backgrounds and personalities, but united by their common house affiliation and their shared nervousness about the challenges that lay ahead. Seamus Finnegan, whose Irish accent and enthusiasm for explosive magic would make him a natural ally in future adventures, possessed the kind of cheerful recklessness that Fred and George immediately recognized as kindred spirit material. Dean Thomas, whose artistic talents and Muggle background provided perspectives that enriched their understanding of both magical and non-magical worlds, brought a thoughtful intelligence to their group that balanced their more impulsive tendencies. Neville Longbottom, whose quiet shyness masked both deep courage and significant magical potential, would require more time to reveal his true character. But even in those early days, Fred and George sensed that their round-faced roommate possessed qualities that would surprise anyone who judged him by his initial timidity. The bonds that formed between the boys during those first weeks at Hogwarts would endure throughout their school years, creating a foundation of friendship and mutual support that would sustain them through challenges both academic and personal. Sleep came fitfully that first night, as excitement about their new environment competed with homesickness for the familiar sounds and smells of the Burrow. Fred and George lay in their beds, whispering to each other across the space between them, sharing observations about their first day and speculating about what tomorrow would bring, their voices gradually growing quieter until exhaustion finally overcame their eagerness to discuss every detail of their Hogwarts experience. The morning brought their first taste of the structured routine that would govern their daily lives for the next 7 years, beginning with the challenge of finding the Great Hall without getting lost in the maze of corridors and staircases that connected the various parts of the castle. Their fellow Gryffindors provided guidance that was both helpful and occasionally misleading, as older students took advantage of first-year confusion to send them on elaborate detours that served no purpose other than entertainment. But even these minor frustrations were part of the education they were receiving about life at Hogwarts, teaching them that survival at the castle required not only academic competence, but also the kind of street wisdom that could distinguish between genuine assistance and elaborate practical jokes. The lessons they learned about reading people's intentions and recognizing potential deception would serve them well in future encounters with more serious threats than misdirection about the location of classrooms. Their first week at Hogwarts was a period of constant discovery as they explored the castle's public areas and began to map its layout in their minds with the systematic thoroughness that would later make them among the most knowledgeable students regarding Hogwarts' architectural secrets. Every corridor held potential passages to investigate. Every staircase offered access to areas that might contain interesting discoveries, and every portrait concealed the possibility of hidden doorways that could provide shortcuts or escape routes for future adventures. The secret passageway behind the statue of Gregory the Smarmy was their first significant discovery, located during an exploration session that had begun as simple curiosity about the decorative elements that lined the corridors near their dormitory. The statue itself was unremarkable, except for its subject's particularly self-satisfied expression, but something about its positioning suggested that it might serve purposes beyond simple decoration, a suspicion that proved accurate when they discovered the mechanism that caused it to swing aside and reveal a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the castle's hidden infrastructure. The passage itself was clearly old, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use, and its air carrying the musty scent that characterized areas of the castle that received little traffic from the cleaning staff. The tunnel stretched further than they had expected, winding through the castle's interior spaces before emerging in a location that was both unexpected and strategically valuable for future reference, though they were careful to memorize its exact route and concealed entrances before sharing their discovery with anyone else. The attention they attracted from Argus Filch, the castle's caretaker, was both inevitable and educational, providing them with their first real understanding of the authority structure that governed student life at Hogwarts and the consequences that awaited those who were caught engaging in unauthorized activities. Filch's approach to discipline was both comprehensive and creative, involving punishments that were designed to discourage repeat offenses while providing maximum inconvenience to the perpetrators of whatever crimes he had detected or suspected. The collection of detention slips and incident reports that began accumulating in Filch's office during Fred and George's first month at Hogwarts grew with sufficient rapidity to require dedicated filing space, a development that both impressed and concerned the caretaker, who had seen many troublesome students during his tenure at the school, but few who displayed such systematic dedication to discovering every possible way to violate school regulations. The twins' ability to find creative interpretations of rules that had been written with the assumption that students would approach them in good faith was both remarkable and infuriating. But it was their encounter with the Room of Requirement during a particularly urgent flight from Filch's pursuit that would provide them with their most valuable discovery of that first year, though they wouldn't fully understand its significance until much later in their Hogwarts career. The room that appeared when they desperately needed a place to hide was perfectly suited to their immediate requirements, containing just enough space for 2 small boys and a collection of cleaning supplies that provided excellent concealment from anyone who might be searching for them. The magical nature of the room's appearance and configuration was obvious even to first-year students, though the full implications of discovering a space that could transform itself according to the user's needs would require years of experimentation and observation to fully appreciate. Fred and George filed the information away in their mental catalogue of useful locations while focusing on the more immediate concern of avoiding whatever punishment Filch had planned for their latest infraction of school regulations. The dung bomb incident that provided their cover for the theft that would change the course of their Hogwarts experience was both spontaneous and brilliantly executed, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that would characterize their approach to more complex operations throughout their school years. The timing required for George to create sufficient distraction, while Fred accessed Filch's confiscated items. Cabinet required the sort of wordless coordination that only twins who had spent their entire lives working together could achieve. The piece of parchment they stole appeared unremarkable to casual observation, just another bit of confiscated student property in a collection that included everything from joke shop novelties to genuinely dangerous magical artifacts that had been surrendered by students whose judgment had proven inadequate for the firm responsibility of owning them. But something about the way the parchment was stored, separated from other items and labeled as particularly hazardous, suggested that its true nature was more complex than its innocent appearance would indicate. The process of learning to activate the Marauder's map was both frustrating and educational, requiring the kind of persistent experimentation that Fred and George approached, with the systematic thoroughness they brought to all their magical investigations. The map's response to their various attempts at activation was subtle but encouraging, with faint stirrings of magic that suggested they were approaching the correct combination of words and intentions without quite achieving the precise formula that would unlock its secrets. The breakthrough came after weeks of trial and error, during a late-night session in their dormitory when exhaustion had lowered their intellectual defenses enough to allow genuine inspiration rather than systematic logic to guide their efforts. The phrase that finally opened the map felt both obvious and impossible, perfectly capturing the spirit of mischief that had motivated its creation, while acknowledging the moral flexibility that made such mischief possible in the first place. The revelation of the map's true nature was overwhelming in its implications, showing them not just the castle's layout but the location and identity of every person within its walls, marking secret passages they had never imagined, and revealing the complex network of hidden routes that connected every part of Hogwarts to every other part through means both conventional and magical. The 4 names that appeared in the corner as the map's creators, Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, were meaningless to them at the time, though they would later learn the true identities of the brilliant students who had created the magical masterpiece they had inherited. The map's impact on their ability to navigate Hogwarts undetected was immediate and profound, transforming them from moderately successful troublemakers into nearly unstoppable forces of creative chaos who could move through the castle with the confidence of students who possessed perfect knowledge of everyone else's location and intentions. The strategic advantage provided by being able to see approaching teachers, prefects, and other authority figures was incalculable, allowing them to time their activities with precision and escape from dangerous situations before they developed into serious problems. Their exploration of the 7 secret passages marked on the map became a systematic project that occupied much of their remaining first year, each route requiring careful investigation to determine its current condition and practical utility for their evolving needs. 4 of the passages proved to be compromised by Filch's knowledge of their existence, though the map's ability to show his location made it possible to use even these routes when circumstances required and proper timing could be assured. The passage behind the mirror on the 4th floor was particularly interesting because of its good condition and relatively secure endpoints, though its eventual collapse would eliminate it from their repertoire of available routes and serve as a reminder that even the most carefully planned infrastructure was subject to the natural wear and deterioration that affected all things over time. The passage at the base of the Whomping Willow remained unexplored during their first year, as they had not yet developed techniques for safely approaching the violent tree that guarded its entrance. But it was the passage that led directly into Honeyduke's sweet shop in Hogsmeade Village that captured their imagination and would serve as their primary means of unauthorized departure from the castle throughout their remaining years at Hogwarts. The tunnel was in excellent condition, its route carefully planned to avoid detection while providing convenient access to the village that represented freedom and opportunity for students who were officially restricted to the castle grounds. Their first unauthorized visit to Hogsmeade was both thrilling and educational, providing them with their initial taste of the independence that awaited them as they grew older. And their understanding of the world beyond Hogwarts expanded to encompass the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. The village itself was enchanting in ways that exceeded their expectations, with shops that specialized in magical goods they had only heard about, and residents who treated their obvious youth with the kind of amused tolerance that suggested unauthorized student visits were neither unexpected nor particularly problematic. The successful completion of their first year at Hogwarts marked not just academic achievement, but the foundation of knowledge and skills that would serve them throughout their remaining time at school and beyond into their professional lives as entrepreneurs and adventurers. They had learned not just the prescribed curriculum, but the unofficial lessons that could only be acquired through direct experience with the castle's mysteries, and the challenge of balancing their natural curiosity with the practical requirements of avoiding serious disciplinary action. The friendships they had formed with Lee Jordan and their other dormitory mates provided them with the social foundation they would need for the increasingly complex adventures that lay ahead, while their growing reputation as entertaining troublemakers had established their place in the informal hierarchy that governed student life at Hogwarts. They had successfully navigated their first year without major disaster while positioning themselves for even greater discoveries in the years to come. The journey home to the Burrow at the end of term was bittersweet, combining excitement about reuniting with their family with genuine regret at leaving behind the magical environment that had become their second home and the friends who had shared their first-year adventures. The Hogwarts Express that carried them back to King's Cross was filled with the chatter of students sharing their experiences and making plans for the summer holidays, but Fred and George spent much of the journey quietly planning their return and the investigations they would undertake during their second year. Their parents' pride in their successful completion of their first year was evident in every embrace and question about their experiences, though Molly's relief that they had avoided serious disciplinary action was equally obvious in her careful inquiries about their conduct and academic performance. Arthur's interest in the magical innovations they had encountered was balanced by his parental concern about the kinds of knowledge they had acquired and the uses to which they might put their expanding understanding of magical theory and practice. The summer that followed their first year at Hogwarts was spent in eager anticipation of their return to the castle and the continuation of their education in both official curricula and unofficial exploration. Though they were careful to spend sufficient time with their younger siblings to maintain the family bonds that remained central to their identity despite their growing independence and expanding horizons. The summer between their first and second years at Hogwarts passed in a blur of eager anticipation and careful preparation, with Fred and George spending countless hours reviewing their mental maps of the castle's secret passages while helping their mother with the endless domestic tasks that kept the Burrow functioning, despite the chaos that seemed to increase exponentially with each passing day. The Marauder's map had been carefully hidden among their possessions, wrapped in spare robes and tucked between textbooks where casual inspection would miss its significance, though they took it out regularly during quiet moments to study its revelations and plan the investigations they would undertake when they returned to school. The revelation of the map's true capabilities had transformed their understanding of Hogwarts from a large and complex building into a living entity whose every corridor and chamber held secrets waiting to be discovered by students, clever enough to recognize the opportunities that surrounded them. The four mysterious creators whose names appeared in the corner, Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, had clearly possessed the same irreverent attitude towards school regulations that Fred and George brought to their own educational experience, though the sophistication of their magical work suggested a level of knowledge and skill that the twins aspired to achieve during their remaining years at the castle. Their second year began with the confident swagger that comes from no longer being the newest and most inexperienced students in their house, though they were careful to maintain the kind of respectful demeanor toward older students that would allow them to continue their unauthorized activities without attracting unnecessary attention from prefects and other authority figures, who might feel obligated to report their more creative interpretations of school rules to the faculty members responsible for maintaining discipline. The tryouts for the Gryffindor Quidditch team provided them with their first real opportunity to demonstrate the flying skills they had developed during years of backyard practice with Bill and Charlie, though the transition from informal family games to competitive house athletics required adjustments in both technique and attitude that challenged their natural confidence and forced them to prove themselves worthy of positions that many older students coveted for themselves. Oliver Wood, the Gryffindor team captain whose dedication to Quidditch bordered on obsession, evaluated their tryout performances with the critical eye of someone who understood that individual talent meant nothing without the ability to work effectively as part of a coordinated team effort. The beta positions they sought required not just physical strength and accurate aim, but the kind of intuitive understanding of game dynamics that could only be developed through extensive practice and genuine commitment to the team's success above personal glory. The coordination that Fred and George displayed during their tryout flights was immediately obvious to observers who understood the requirements of effective beta play, as they demonstrated the ability to anticipate each other's movements and coordinate their attacks on opposing players with precision that seemed almost telepathic in its accuracy. Their natural partnership, enhanced by years of shared adventures and mutual trust, translated perfectly to the demands of Quidditch strategy, where split-second decisions and absolute reliability from teammates could mean the difference between victory and humiliating defeat. Their selection for the team was announced with the kind of ceremony that Oliver reserved for truly significant occasions, though his pleasure at their addition to the roster was tempered by stern warnings about the commitment and dedication that would be required from all team members during the upcoming season. The practice schedule he outlined was demanding enough to challenge even students whose academic load was relatively light, but Fred and George accepted the requirements with enthusiasm that reflected their genuine excitement about representing their house in official competition. The reputation they quickly developed as effective beaters was built on their ability to work together in ways that opposing teams found difficult to predict or counter, using their identical appearance and synchronized movements to create confusion about their individual intentions, while delivering coordinated attacks that were more devastating than the sum of their separate abilities. The nickname, human bludgers, that they earned from opposing players was both complimentary and slightly fearful, acknowledging their effectiveness, while suggesting that facing them on the Quidditch pitch was an experience that most players preferred to avoid. But even as they excelled in their new roles as official representatives of Gryffindor House, Fred and George continued to pursue their unofficial education in the art of creative mischief, using the knowledge they had gained from the Marauder's map to explore areas of the castle that were officially forbidden to students, and to develop increasingly sophisticated approaches to avoiding detection during their unauthorized activities. Their venture into the Forbidden Forest was both thrilling and educational, providing them with their first real understanding of the magical creatures that lived in the wild areas surrounding Hogwarts and the reasons why students were discouraged from exploring these regions without proper supervision and preparation. The forest itself was beautiful in the way that truly dangerous places often are, with ancient trees whose branches formed cathedral spaces filled with filtered sunlight, and the sounds of creatures that existed nowhere else in the magical world. The discovery of their unauthorized expedition by Professor Dumbledore was handled with the kind of measured response that characterized the headmaster's approach to student discipline, combining genuine concern for their safety with recognition that curiosity about the world beyond the castle was a natural and generally healthy impulse that deserved guidance rather than harsh punishment. The conversation that followed their capture was more educational than punitive, though they understood that future violations of forest restrictions would be met with consequences more severe than gentle lectures about the importance of following safety regulations. The summer that followed their second year brought changes to the Weasley household that would affect the entire family's dynamic, beginning with Percy's selection as a prefect for his 5th year at Hogwarts, and his subsequent transformation into someone whose sense of importance and authority seemed to grow daily as the new school term approached. The prefect badge that arrived with his Hogwarts letter became a constant presence on his robes, polished to mirror brightness and displayed with the kind of pride that his younger brothers found both amusing and mildly irritating. Percy's new status as a prefect created opportunities for the kinds of pranks that Fred and George found irresistible, though they were careful to ensure that their jokes remained good-natured rather than genuinely harmful to their brother's reputation or self-confidence. The badge switching, uniform modifications, and strategic interruptions of his increasingly pompous conversations with their parents were designed to deflate his ego without causing real damage to his standing within the family or his prospects for success at school. Ron's preparation for his first year at Hogwarts provided Fred and George with legitimate opportunities to share their knowledge of school life, while engaging in the time-honored tradition of terrifying younger siblings with exaggerated accounts of the challenges and dangers that awaited them. Their descriptions of the sorting process as a painful ordeal involving physical trials were creative fiction rather than malicious deception, designed more to provide entertainment for themselves than to cause genuine distress to their youngest brother. The journey to King's Cross Station for the beginning of their 3rd year was memorable primarily for their encounter with a young boy who was clearly struggling with the magical barrier that concealed Platform 9 and D, 3/4 from Muggle observation, though his obvious need for assistance triggered their natural impulse to help fellow students navigate the complexities of magical travel. Their guidance was both practical and encouraging, demonstrating the kind of casual competence that they had developed during their 2 years of experience with the requirements of Hogwarts life. The prank they played on their mother regarding their identities was harmless fun that reflected their delight in the confusion that their identical appearance could create among people who didn't know them well enough to distinguish their individual personalities. Though Molly's momentary uncertainty was quickly resolved through the kind of maternal intuition that had allowed her to identify her children correctly, despite their best efforts at deception throughout their lives. Their assistance with Harry Potter's luggage was motivated by simple courtesy rather than any recognition of his famous status, though the revelation of his identity when he pushed his hair away from his scar created the kind of excitement that any young wizard would feel upon meeting the boy who lived, whose story had been part of their cultural background since childhood. Their reaction was natural and appropriate, combining genuine awe with the kind of respectful curiosity that his unique position in their world deserved. The introduction they facilitated between Harry and Ron was handled with the diplomatic skill that Fred and George had developed through years of managing complex family relationships, ensuring that their younger brother made a positive impression on someone who would clearly be an important part of his Hogwarts experience, while avoiding the kind of overwhelming attention that might have made Harry uncomfortable with the social dynamics he was encountering. Their promise to send Ginny letters and presents from school was made with genuine affection for their little sister and sincere intentions of maintaining regular contact with home during their months away, though their track record with correspondence suggested that their actual performance would likely fall short of their enthusiastic promises despite their best efforts to remember their family obligations amid the distractions of school life. The sorting ceremony that welcomed new students into their houses was familiar to Fred and George by now, but they watched with particular interest as their younger brother was evaluated by the sorting hat and ultimately placed in Gryffindor alongside them, ensuring that the Weasley family tradition of house loyalty would continue for another generation. Their chant of, "We got Potter! We got Potter!" when Harry was also sorted into their house, reflected both their excitement about having such a famous housemate and their natural tendency to celebrate anything that brought credit to Gryffindor. The warning that Professor Dumbledore directed specifically toward them during his start-of-term speech was delivered with the kind of knowing amusement that suggested he was well aware of their reputation for creative place, interpretation of school rules, though his reminder about the Forbidden Forest restrictions was serious enough to indicate that their previous adventure had been noted and would not be overlooked if repeated. The balance between gentle humor and firm authority in his approach reflected his understanding of how to manage students who were fundamentally good-hearted, but occasionally lacking in judgment. The new defense against the dark arts teacher, Professor Quirrell, was an object of immediate fascination for Fred and George, whose experience with the subject had been limited to theoretical study and whose curiosity about practical applications was naturally aroused by a teacher who had allegedly encountered real dark arts practitioners during his travels. Their theory about his turban being stuffed with garlic to ward off vampires was creative speculation rather than serious analysis, though it reflected their tendency to develop elaborate explanations for anything that seemed mysterious or unusual. The Gryffindor Quidditch team's prospects for the coming season were clouded by the graduation of Charlie Weasley 2 years earlier, and the subsequent decline in their performance, though Oliver Wood's enthusiasm for their chances was infectious enough to convince even skeptical observers that improvement was possible with sufficient dedication and strategic planning. The addition of Harry Potter as their new seeker was announced with the kind of excitement that suggested Oliver believed their House Cup drought was finally coming to an end. Fred and George's approach to welcoming Harry onto the team was characteristically direct and encouraging, combining practical information about their roles as beaters with confident predictions about their chances for success that reflected their genuine optimism about the season ahead. Their assurance that they would win the Quidditch Cup was based more on enthusiasm than careful analysis, but their confidence was grounded in real improvements to their team composition and their own development as effective players. The first match of the season provided them with their introduction to the kind of crisis management that would become a regular feature of Harry's Hogwarts experience. As his broomstick began behaving erratically in ways that suggested magical interference rather than mechanical failure, their immediate response was to attempt a rescue that demonstrated both their loyalty to their teammate and their understanding of the serious dangers that magical sabotage could create during Quidditch matches. The coordinated effort they made to position themselves beneath Harry's unstable broom showed the tactical thinking they had developed through their partnership, anticipating the most likely trajectory of a potential fall, while maintaining their own positions in the game that was continuing around them. Their relief when his broom stabilized and he was able to complete the match successfully was genuine and intense, reflecting their growing attachment to their young teammate and their natural protective instincts toward anyone they considered part of their extended family. The Christmas holidays that year provided their first opportunity to experience Hogwarts during the quiet period when most students returned home to their families, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and relaxation that was very different from the bustling energy that characterized the castle during normal term time. Their decision to remain at school with Percy and Ron was motivated partly by their parents' travel plans to visit Bill, and partly by their curiosity about how the castle functioned when its population was reduced to a small fraction of its usual size. The hand-knitted sweaters that arrived from their mother on Christmas morning were part of a family tradition that had evolved over years of separated celebrations, each one individually designed with letters that identified the recipient, while maintaining the collective identity that marked them as products of Molly Weasley's love and attention to her children's needs. The addition of a sweater for Harry Potter reflected their mother's immediate adoption of him into their extended family circle, treating him with the same generous affection she showed to her own sons. Their joke about their mother making more effort for non-family members was delivered with the kind of affectionate teasing that characterized their relationship with their parents, acknowledging her kindness while gently mocking the implication that outsiders received better treatment than her own children. The humor in their observation about being called Gred and Forge reflected their long-standing amusement at their mother's occasional confusion about their individual identities, though they understood that her love for them was never confused regardless of which name she used. The Christmas dinner that brought together the remaining Gryffindors was memorable for its combination of excellent food and relaxed conversation that allowed them to get to know Harry better, while sharing family traditions that helped him understand what he had been missing during his years with the Dursleys. The games that followed dinner provided opportunities for the kind of casual bonding that formal interactions couldn't achieve, creating relationships that would endure throughout their shared Hogwarts experience. The theft of Percy's prefect badge that night was a spontaneous prank that reflected their inability to resist opportunities for harmless mischief, though the chase that followed provided entertainment for everyone present, while allowing Percy to demonstrate that his new authority hadn't completely eliminated his sense of humor. The laughter that accompanied their wild pursuit through the common room was exactly the kind of family bonding that Christmas was supposed to create, even when it involved temporary theft of important accessories. The training sessions that prepared them for their next Quidditch match were complicated by Oliver Wood's increasing intensity about their performance and his tendency to deliver lengthy strategic analyses that tested even his most dedicated players' attention spans. Fred and George's response to these sessions was to maintain their focus on the practical aspects of their roles while finding creative ways to stay alert during the theoretical discussions that seemed to energize their captain far more than they inspired his team. Their dive-bombing exercises and mock falls were designed to test their broom's responsiveness and their own reflexes under pressure, though Oliver's criticism of their methods reflected his concern that their natural tendency toward entertainment might interfere with their ability to take training seriously when matches approached. The balance between maintaining team morale through humor and developing the skills needed for competitive success was delicate, requiring adjustments from both the captain and his players. The news that Professor Snape would be refereeing their next match was received with the kind of dismay that any Gryffindor student would feel upon learning that someone with obvious bias against their house would be controlling the rules. During an important competition, George's fall from his broom upon hearing this announcement was both genuine accident and symbolic representation of how the team felt about this development, though they understood that official protests would be both futile and potentially counterproductive. Their performance during the match itself was complicated by Snape's obvious favoritism toward Hufflepuff and his willingness to make calls that seemed designed more to disadvantage Gryffindor than to maintain fair play, though their experience with biased authority figures had prepared them to adapt their strategy to compensate for unfavorable officiating. George's frustrated attempt to hit a bludger at the referee was an understandable reaction to obvious injustice, though it resulted in penalties that made their victory more difficult to achieve. The celebration that followed their win was enhanced by the knowledge that they had succeeded despite external obstacles that would have provided convenient excuses for failure, making their triumph feel more significant than a simple victory over their opponents. The party in their common room was fueled by food that Fred and George had acquired through their knowledge of Castle's hidden passages and their relationship with the kitchen staff, who appreciated students who understood the value of their work. The expedition to tickle the giant squid's tentacles was the kind of spontaneous adventure that characterized their approach to leisure time at Hogwarts, combining mild danger with genuine curiosity about the magical creatures that inhabited the castle's grounds. The squid's response to their attention was more positive than threatening, suggesting that it appreciated the interaction with students brave enough to approach it directly, rather than simply observing from a safe distance. Harry's hospitalization following his encounter with Fluffy and the obstacles guarding the Philosopher's Stone provided Fred and George with their first real understanding of the serious dangers that could threaten students who became involved in adult conflicts, though their response was characteristically practical rather than dramatically emotional. The toilet seat they attempted to send as a get-well present was typical of their approach to crisis management, using humor to express affection while acknowledging the absurdity of trying to provide conventional comfort to someone recovering from extraordinary adventures. The end-of-term warnings about using magic outside school were familiar to them by now, though their continued hope that these restrictions might be forgotten reflected their optimistic belief that bureaucratic oversight might occasionally fail in ways that would benefit creative students. The summer that awaited them at home would provide opportunities to spend time with their family while planning for the adventures that their third year at Hogwarts would bring, though they were already beginning to understand that their education was preparing them for challenges that extended far beyond simple academic achievement. The drive to rescue Harry from his relative's house using Arthur's flying Ford Anglia was both daring and necessary, demonstrating their growing willingness to take significant risks when protecting someone they considered part of their extended family. The mission required careful planning and precise execution, as failure would have resulted in serious consequences for both the rescued and the rescuers. though their confidence in their abilities and their commitment to Harry's well-being made the dangers seem manageable rather than prohibitive. Their skill with Muggle lockpicking techniques reflected the practical education they had received from their father about non-magical problem-solving methods, though their application of these skills to unauthorized entry demonstrated that they understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical applications. The pride they took in their technical competence was matched by their pleasure in Harry's surprise at discovering that wizards could master Muggle skills when circumstances required such adaptability. The successful completion of their rescue mission was celebrated with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from helping someone in genuine need, while demonstrating competence under pressure, though their mother's reaction upon discovering their unauthorized adventure reminded them that heroic gestures often carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate situation they were designed to address. The balance between doing what was right and doing what was officially acceptable was something they would continue to navigate throughout their remaining time at school and beyond, into their adult lives as members of the magical community. The second year at Hogwarts began with whispers of something ancient and terrible stirring within the castle's stone walls, though Fred and George approached these rumors with the skeptical curiosity that characterized their response to most adult anxieties about student safety. The Chamber of Secrets, according to the hushed conversations they overheard in corridors and common rooms, was a legendary place created by Salazar Slytherin himself, hidden somewhere within the school and containing a monster that could be controlled only by his true heir to purge Hogwarts of students deemed unworthy of magical education. The petrifications that began occurring shortly after the term started created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that was entirely foreign to the usually cheerful environment of their school, transforming familiar corridors into places where students traveled in groups and teachers maintained constant vigilance for signs of the threat that seemed capable of striking anywhere at any time. Mrs. Norris, Filch's beloved cat, was the first victim, found rigid as stone beside a message written in what appeared to be blood, announcing that the chamber had been opened and enemies of the heir should beware. Fred and George's reaction to the crisis was characteristically practical, focusing on the immediate implications for their own activities, rather than engaging in the kind of dramatic speculation that occupied most of their classmates' conversations about the mysterious attacks. The increased security measures and heightened awareness of student movements would make their unofficial exploration of the castle more challenging, requiring adjustments to their methods and more careful timing of their adventures, though they had no intention of allowing fear to curtail their educational activities entirely. The Quidditch match that had promised to be one of their most challenging contests of the season instead became a terrifying demonstration of magical sabotage when a rogue bludger began pursuing Harry with single-minded determination that clearly indicated deliberate enchantment rather than random equipment malfunction. The bull's behavior was so obviously abnormal that even spectators who knew nothing about Quidditch rules could see that something was seriously wrong with the way it ignored all other players to focus exclusively on their seeker. Fred and George's immediate response was to abandon their normal beta strategy and concentrate entirely on protecting Harry from the enchanted ball that seemed capable of inflicting serious injury or death if it succeeded in making solid contact with its target. Their coordination during this crisis was flawless, demonstrating the kind of partnership that could only exist between players who trusted each other absolutely and shared identical priorities about protecting their teammate from harm, regardless of the cost to their team's chances of victory. The timeout that George called was a desperate attempt to address the situation through official channels, hoping that adult intervention might be able to neutralize the threat that was making normal play impossible. though Harry's insistence that they leave him alone and continue with the match reflected either remarkable courage or dangerous stubbornness. Their argument with Oliver Wood about his tactical advice revealed the conflict between achieving victory and ensuring survival that characterized many of the decisions they would face during their remaining years at Hogwarts. The injury that Harry sustained when the rogue bludger finally made contact was both inevitable and horrifying, his arm broken so severely that even magical healing would require time and careful treatment to restore full function, though his successful capture of the golden snitch, while unconscious, demonstrated the kind of instinctive skill that had made him legendary among Quidditch players throughout the school. Their immediate action to restrain the still pursuing ball showed their understanding that the threat continued even after their teammate had been injured and the match had officially ended. The vigil they maintained at Harry's bedside while he recovered from his injuries was motivated by genuine affection and concern, though their gifts of cakes, sweets, and pumpkin juice reflected their belief that appropriate nutrition and familiar comforts were essential components of any effective healing process. George's praise for Harry's flying during the match was sincere recognition of exceptional skill displayed under impossible circumstances, acknowledging that few players could have maintained their focus and effectiveness while being actively hunted by a weapon designed to cause maximum physical damage. The speculation that Harry Potter himself might be the heir of Slytherin responsible for opening the Chamber of Secrets was so absurd that Fred and George treated it as an opportunity for entertainment rather than a serious accusation, deserving thoughtful consideration. Their theatrical announcements of "Make way for the heir of Slytherin" as they escorted Harry through the corridors were designed to highlight the ridiculousness of suspecting someone whose character and actions had consistently demonstrated his commitment to protecting others rather than harming them. The Christmas holidays provided a welcome respite from the atmosphere of suspicion and fear that had dominated the school since the attacks began, though the reduced number of students remaining at Hogwarts created an intimacy that made the absence of their usual companions more noticeable. The exploding snap games in the common room and the casual conversations over meals allowed them to maintain some semblance of normal school life despite the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded them. Their modification of Percy's prefect badge to read Pinhead instead of prefect was exactly the kind of harmless prank that the season required, providing humor that helped maintain morale while demonstrating that fear had not completely eliminated their capacity for creative mischief. The laughter that greeted this minor vandalism was particularly precious during a time when genuine joy had become increasingly rare within the castle walls, reminding everyone present that their essential natures remained unchanged despite external pressures. The petrification of Hermione Granger struck Fred and George with particular force because of her connection to Ron and Harry, making the attacks feel personal rather than simply tragic events affecting unknown victims, though their response was characteristically focused on practical support rather than emotional displays that might have added to their friends' distress. They understood that grief and fear were natural responses to such events, but they also recognized that dwelling on emotions that couldn't change the situation was less helpful than maintaining the kind of steady presence that provided comfort through consistency. The news that Ginny had been taken into the Chamber of Secrets transformed their concern from abstract worry about school safety into immediate terror for their beloved little sister, whose life was now directly threatened by whatever monster had been responsible for the earlier attacks. The family meeting in the common room was conducted in the kind of stunned silence that accompanies truly devastating news, each of them processing the implications of losing someone whose presence had been central to their understanding of home and family. Their decision to go to bed after hours of fruitless vigil reflected their understanding that exhaustion would not help Ginny and might actually impair their ability to function effectively if opportunities arose to contribute to rescue efforts. Though the act of leaving the common room felt like abandonment of their sister when she needed their support most desperately, the sleep that eventually claimed them was troubled and brief, interrupted by dreams that featured scenarios too horrible to contemplate while awake. The relief that flooded through them when Harry and Ron emerged from the chamber with Ginny alive and relatively unharmed was so intense that it temporarily overwhelmed their capacity for coherent thought or speech, leaving them capable only of the kind of physical contact that communicated emotions too deep for words. The explanations that followed about Tom Riddle's diary and its influence over their sister provided context for her recent behavior, while raising questions about magical artifacts and their potential for causing harm to innocent users. The journey home for the summer holidays was conducted in an atmosphere of celebration mixed with exhaustion, as the resolution of the chamber crisis had lifted the oppressive fear that had dominated their second year, while leaving everyone emotionally drained from months of constant anxiety about their safety and that of their friends. The compartment they shared with Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny became a space for decompression and gradual return to the kind of normal social interaction that had been impossible during the height of the crisis. Ginny's revelation about Percy's girlfriend provided exactly the kind of gossip that the situation required, offering a topic of conversation that was interesting without being threatening and giving them opportunity to tease their older brother about romantic developments that explained his recent secretive behavior. Fred's accidental dropping of books on George's head was the kind of physical comedy that helped restore their sense of normal sibling relationships after months of fearing for each other's lives. The Egyptian vacation that summer provided their family with experiences that none of them had ever imagined possible, funded by Arthur's lottery winnings and organized around Bill's expertise with ancient magical sites that tourists rarely had opportunity to visit. The pyramids and tombs they explored were monuments to magical achievements that predated Hogwarts by millennia, containing spells and enchantments that had been crafted by wizards whose understanding of magic was both different from and complementary to modern magical theory. Fred and George's attempt to trap Percy in one of the tombs was prevented by their mother's vigilant supervision, though their disappointment at being thwarted in this particular prank was balanced by genuine fascination with the magical architecture surrounding them and appreciation for the educational opportunities that international travel provided. The experience of seeing magic practiced on such a grand scale expanded their understanding of what was possible when sufficient knowledge, resources, and ambition were combined in pursuit of lasting achievement. The remainder of their summer was spent at the Leaky Cauldron, where their reunion with Harry provided opportunities to catch up on his experiences with his Muggle relatives, while sharing their own adventures in Egypt and their observations about the changes that had occurred in their family dynamics since Percy's elevation to head boy status. Their mockery of his increasingly formal speech patterns was affectionate rather than cruel, though they couldn't resist highlighting the contrast between his new pompous manner and the more relaxed personality he had displayed during previous years. Mrs. Weasley's announcement of Percy's achievement as head boy was delivered with the pride that any mother would feel upon seeing her child recognized for academic excellence and leadership potential, though her pointed observation that Fred and George had not received prefect badges suggested that she remained concerned about their priorities and their commitment to following the rules that governed student behavior at Hogwarts. Their response that prefect status would take all the fun out of life reflected their genuine belief that official authority would compromise their ability to pursue the kinds of adventures that made school interesting. The ministry cars that transported them to King's Cross Station were impressive examples of official magical transportation, though George's joke about the flags and initials that might identify Percy's importance was designed to deflate his brother's ego rather than express genuine respect for his new position. Fred's suggestion that the initials might stand for Humongous Big Head was particularly effective at generating laughter while reminding Percy that family relationships remained unchanged despite his official recognition. The theft and modification of Percy's headboy badge that night provided exactly the kind of entertainment that their return to school required, demonstrating that their capacity for creative mischief had not been diminished by their experiences during the previous year or their growing awareness of the serious responsibilities that awaited them as older students. The badge reading Big Head Boy was a perfect example of their ability to combine technical skill with social commentary, creating humor while making a point about the dangers of taking oneself too seriously. The Quidditch practice that began their third year was conducted under Oliver Wood's increasingly intense supervision, as his awareness that this would be his final season at Hogwarts motivated him to pursue victory with single-minded determination that sometimes exceeded his players' enthusiasm for exhaustive training sessions. His praise for Fred and George's abilities as beaters was genuine recognition of their development into formidable players whose coordination and tactical understanding had improved dramatically since their first tentative tryouts. Their excitement about visiting Zonko's joke shop during their first authorized trip to Hogsmeade reflected their professional interest in magical pranks and their curiosity about commercial applications for the kinds of creative mischief they had been pursuing as amateur hobbyists. The shop itself was everything they had imagined, and more, filled with products that demonstrated the possibilities for turning entertainment into profitable enterprise while providing inspiration for their own experimental projects. The disappointment of their loss to Hufflepuff when Cedric Diggory caught the golden snitch while Harry fell victim to Dementor influence was compounded by their knowledge that their team had been capable of victory under normal circumstances, though the supernatural despair created by the dark creatures had made normal performance impossible for players who lacked specific training in resisting their effects. Their presence at Harry's bedside during his recovery showed their understanding that some defeats were more about external circumstances than individual or team failure. Fred's attempt to comfort Harry by pointing out that everyone eventually missed the snitch was well-intentioned, but reflected incomplete understanding of how seriously their friend took his responsibilities as team seeker. Though George's additional reassurance about their continued chances for the House Cup showed their grasp of the mathematics involved in tournament competition, their final encouragement about his status as their best seeker ever was both accurate assessment and emotional support, recognizing exceptional ability while providing perspective on temporary setbacks. The gift of the Marauder's map to Harry represented a significant sacrifice for Fred and George, who had used the magical document as the foundation for their unauthorized activities since their first year at Hogwarts, though they understood that Harry's need for safe passage to Hogsmeade outweighed their own attachment to the artifact that had served them so well. Their explanation of the map's capabilities and their guidance about which passages were safe to use demonstrated both their practical knowledge and their genuine concern for his well-being. The instructions they provided about the map's operation were delivered with the kind of casual competence that characterized their approach to most magical challenges, treating the complex enchantments that enabled the document's function as interesting technical features rather than miraculous achievements deserving reverent treatment. Their wink and promise to see Harry and Honeydukes showed their confidence that he would successfully master the map's use while maintaining their own access to the village through alternative methods. The victory celebration that followed Gryffindor's defeat of Ravenclaw was enhanced by the food and drinks that Fred and George had acquired through their knowledge of the castle's hidden passages and their relationships with staff members who appreciated students capable of creative problem-solving, though their mysterious absence during the procurement process demonstrated their understanding that some activities were best conducted without witnesses who might feel obligated to report unauthorized behavior to appropriate authorities. Angelina Johnson's question about their methods was answered with appropriate discretion, acknowledging their debt to the map's creators while avoiding detailed explanations that might compromise their continuing ability to use similar techniques in future situations. Their whispered reference to a little help from Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot and Prongs was both accurate credit and deliberate mystery, honoring the unknown students who had created their most valuable tool while maintaining the secrecy that had protected it for years. The pressure that built toward the Quidditch Cup final was managed by Fred and George through their characteristic approach of becoming louder and more exuberant than ever, using humor and energy to combat the tension that might otherwise have interfered with their performance when victory or defeat would be determined by their ability to function effectively under extreme pressure. Their understanding that anxiety was counterproductive motivated them to create an atmosphere of confidence and celebration that would support optimal performance from their entire team. The match itself was conducted with the kind of intensity that championship competitions deserved, featuring sophisticated strategy and skilled execution from both teams, as they pursued the ultimate prize that would validate months of training and preparation. George's perfect bludger hit that prevented a Slytherin score while setting up Angelina's successful goal demonstrated the tactical awareness and precise timing that had made him and Fred such effective partners throughout their Quidditch careers. The violent retaliation that followed Marcus Flint's deliberate assault on Angelina was both predictable and appropriate, showing that Fred and George understood the difference between competitive play and malicious attack, while demonstrating their willingness to protect teammates from opponents who abandoned sportsmanship in pursuit of victory. Fred's bludger to the back of Flint's head was calculated to cause sufficient pain to discourage further dirty tactics without inflicting permanent injury that might escalate the conflict beyond manageable boundaries. Their protective formation around Katie Bell when she carried the quaffle showed their adaptation to opponents who were willing to use illegal violence as tactical strategy, providing physical security that allowed their teammate to function effectively. Despite the threats she faced from Slytherin players who had abandoned any pretense of following established rules, the coordination required for this defensive strategy demonstrated their ability to modify their roles in response to changing circumstances while maintaining their effectiveness as offensive players. The championship victory that concluded their fourth year as team members was particularly sweet because it had been earned through superior play rather than luck or favorable officiating, validating their dedication to the sport and their development as players who could perform at the highest levels of competition. The celebration that followed was both reward for past effort and motivation for continued excellence during their remaining years as students with opportunities to represent their house in official competition. The intense studying that occupied Fred and George during the weeks leading up to their OL examinations was uncharacteristic behavior that reflected their understanding of these tests' importance for their future opportunities, though their approach to academic preparation remained distinctly different from the methodical techniques that more conventional students employed when facing crucial evaluations. Their decision to focus on only 3 subjects was strategic rather than lazy, concentrating their limited study time on areas where success was most achievable rather than attempting comprehensive preparation that might result in mediocre performance across all subjects. The results they achieved on their chosen examinations were sufficient to demonstrate their capabilities while leaving them free to pursue the experimental activities that had occupied most of their attention during their years at Hogwarts. Though their parents' reaction to both their limited participation and their actual scores reflected the ongoing tension between family expectations and individual priorities that had characterized their relationship with adult authority throughout their adolescence. The development of their joke shop business during that summer represented the culmination of years of experimentation and learning, transforming their casual interest in magical pranks into serious preparation for professional careers that would allow them to support themselves while pursuing work that aligned with their natural talents and interests. The explosions that had regularly emanated from their bedroom for years were finally revealed as productive research rather than mere chaos. Though the distinction had been difficult to recognize for family members who lacked technical knowledge about the complexities involved in creating reliable magical products, the order forms they developed showed their understanding of marketing and customer service principles that would be essential for successful business operations. Though their mother's discovery and destruction of these documents created conflict that went beyond simple disagreement about appropriate bedroom activities to encompass fundamental differences in values and definitions of worthwhile work, the fight that followed revealed the depth of their commitment to their chosen path and their willingness to defend their decisions against family pressure that was motivated by love but informed by different priorities. Mrs. Weasley's preference for ministry employment reflected her desire for her sons to achieve the kind of security and respectability that government service provided, though her comparison of their achievements to Percy's success ignored the significant differences in their personalities, interests, and definitions of meaningful accomplishment. The dragon dung they sent to Percy's office was both retaliation for his condescending attitude and demonstration of their opinion about the kind of work that their mother considered appropriate for ambitious young wizards. The excitement they felt about having Bill and Charlie home for the World Cup was enhanced by their anticipation of sharing their business plans with older brothers, whose adventures and achievements had inspired their own ambitions, though they understood that family approval of their entrepreneurial activities was less important than their own confidence in their ability to create products that customers would value sufficiently to support profitable operations. The Tung Toffee incident with Dudley Dursley was both product demonstration and justified revenge against someone whose bullying behavior had made Harry's childhood miserable, though the spectacular results exceeded even their expectations for the effectiveness of their experimental candy in producing dramatic physical transformation. Their eager questions about the outcome showed their professional interest in their creation's performance while revealing their satisfaction at turning their skills against someone who deserved whatever discomfort he experienced. The discipline they received for this prank was complicated by their father's disapproval of targeting muggles with magical products and their mother's fury about unauthorized testing of Weasley's wizard wheezes, marchandises, though they maintained that their actions had been justified by Dudley's character and behavior, rather than motivated by malicious intent toward innocent victims. The fight that followed was more restrained than previous conflicts because of their guests' presence, but it established clear boundaries about acceptable applications for their developing product line. The World Cup experience provided them with their first opportunity to observe professional Quidditch at the highest levels of competition, while serving as inspiration for their own continued development, as players who might someday achieve similar recognition for their athletic abilities. The betting opportunity that Ludo Bagman offered seemed too good to refuse, combining their confidence in their analytical abilities with their natural inclination toward calculated risks that might provide capital for their business ventures. The bet itself was strategically sound, predicting that Ireland would win the overall match while Victor Krum would catch the golden snitch, a scenario that required sophisticated understanding of team dynamics and individual player capabilities, rather than simple speculation about likely outcomes. Bagman's acceptance of their wager and his interest in their fake wand demonstration suggested that their products had genuine commercial potential that extended beyond their immediate social circle to include adult wizards with professional experience in magical entertainment. The victory that vindicated their analytical skills was celebrated with the kind of satisfaction that comes from successful risk-taking based on careful preparation and accurate assessment, though their pleasure at winning was enhanced by the knowledge that the gold they received would provide startup capital for business ventures that might otherwise have been delayed by lack of financial resources. Their father's warning about concealing their gambling activities from their mother reflected his understanding of her likely reaction to discovering that her underage sons had been engaging in adult activities that combined speculation with significant financial risk. The Death Eater attack that night provided Fred and George with their first direct encounter with the kind of organized evil that had motivated their parents' participation in the Order of the Phoenix, though their immediate response was focused on protecting Ginny rather than engaging with philosophical questions about the nature of dark magic and its practitioners. The experience of guiding their little sister to safety through chaos created by adult wizards who had abandoned moral constraints was both terrifying and educational, providing practical knowledge about crisis management that no classroom instruction could have conveyed. Their mother's tearful reunion with them upon their safe return to the Burrow was complicated by her regret about their last conversation before the trip, though her relief at their survival overwhelmed any lingering irritation about their failure to take sufficient OWLs or their continued pursuit of unauthorized business activities. The combination of fear for their safety and pride in their protective instincts toward Ginny created emotional complexity that transcended simple parental approval or disapproval of their choices. The discovery that their winnings had been leprechaun gold that disappeared after a few hours was both educational and frustrating, teaching them about the varieties of magical fraud while eliminating the startup capital they had planned to use for business expansion. Their assumption that Bagman had made an honest mistake rather than deliberately deceiving them reflected their natural tendency to assume good intentions until proven otherwise, though subsequent events would require revision of this charitable interpretation. The letter-writing campaign they began to recover their legitimate winnings demonstrated both their understanding of proper business communication and their determination to pursue justice through appropriate channels before considering alternative approaches to conflict resolution. Their careful attention to tone and content showed their awareness that accusations of fraud required delicate handling to avoid creating additional problems, while ensuring that their concerns were taken seriously by someone with authority to address their legitimate grievances. The fourth year at Hogwarts arrived with unprecedented excitement as the ancient Triwizard Tournament was announced to return after a century of absence, bringing with it international delegations, magical competitions that would test the very limits of student ability, and prize money that represented more gold than Fred and George had ever imagined possessing in their entire lives. The 1,000 galleons promised to the tournament champion seemed like a fortune capable of solving every financial obstacle that stood between them and their dreams of entrepreneurial independence. Though the age restriction that limited participation to students of 17 years or older appeared to present an insurmountable barrier to their ambitions, Dumbledore's pointed look in their direction as he explained the age limit and warned against attempting to circumvent the magical protections that would enforce it was both amusing and slightly insulting, suggesting that their reputation for creative rule interpretation had reached the highest levels of school administration. But rather than discouraging their interest in the tournament, the challenge of overcoming Dumbledore's defenses appealed to their natural inclination towards solving impossible problems through innovative thinking and careful observation of magical systems that others accepted as immutable. The arrival of the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang delegations provided their first real exposure to international magical education and the different approaches to learning that characterized schools in other countries, though their immediate attention was focused on identifying potential weaknesses in the tournament's security measures rather than engaging in cultural exchange with their foreign guests. The students from these prestigious institutions carried themselves with confidence that suggested superior magical training, creating both inspiration and competitive motivation for Hogwarts students who had never questioned the adequacy of their own education. Igor Karkaroff's presence as Durmstrang's headmaster was particularly interesting to Fred and George, whose knowledge of recent wizarding history included awareness of his former association with Death Eaters and his controversial testimony during the trials that followed Voldemort's first defeat. The rehabilitation of former dark arts practitioners remained a contentious issue in magical society, and his current position of authority over young wizards raised questions about redemption and the possibility of genuine character change that were too complex for easy answers. The Goblet of Fire itself was an impressive magical artifact whose blue flames seemed to dance with intelligence and purpose, suggesting enchantments of extraordinary sophistication that had been crafted by masters whose understanding of magic exceeded anything taught in contemporary educational institutions. The age line that surrounded it was visible as a thin golden circle that appeared deceptively simple, though Dumbledore's confidence in its effectiveness suggested that the protective magic was far more complex than its modest appearance indicated. Fred and George's analysis of the age line was conducted with the systematic thoroughness they brought to all magical challenges, observing its behavior and testing its responses to various stimuli while developing theories about the underlying enchantments that might be vulnerable to creative interpretation. Their conclusion that a simple aging potion would be sufficient to fool the protective magic was based on logical reasoning about how the line might distinguish between eligible and ineligible students, though their confidence would prove to be misplaced. The brewing of their aging potion was accomplished with the same attention to detail they applied to their joke shop products, using ingredients obtained through legitimate channels and following established procedures that had been tested by generations of students seeking to appear older than their actual years. The potion itself was perfectly crafted according to traditional standards, possessing the correct color, consistency, and magical signature that indicated successful completion of a complex brewing process. Lee Jordan's participation in their age enhancement experiment added an element of moral support while providing additional insurance against potential dangers that might arise from using untested magic on themselves, though his primary contribution was enthusiastic encouragement rather than practical assistance with the technical aspects of their plan. The friendship they shared had deepened over their years at Hogwarts into the kind of loyalty that made shared risks feel like adventures rather than reckless endangerment. The public nature of their attempt was both intentional spectacle and practical necessity, as the age line's location in a heavily trafficked area made private experimentation impossible, while their natural showmanship made them reluctant to waste an opportunity for entertaining their fellow students. The audience that gathered to watch their experiment was both supportive and skeptical, understanding their motivation while doubting their chances of success against magical protections designed by someone of Dumbledore's legendary abilities. Fred's successful crossing of the age line created momentary triumph that was both exhilarating and vindicated their analytical approach to magical problem-solving, though the celebration was premature given that George had yet to attempt his own crossing and the goblet had not actually accepted their names as legitimate tournament entries. The confidence they felt in that brief moment of apparent success was intoxicating, suggesting that their understanding of magic was sophisticated enough to overcome obstacles that had deterred other students from even attempting similar challenges. The violent rejection that launched both twins backward while sprouting magnificent white beards was both physically jarring and profoundly educational. demonstrating that Dumbledore's magical protections operated on principles more complex than simple age detection, and that their analysis had failed to account for important variables in the enchantments they were attempting to circumvent. The beards themselves were works of art that would have been impressive under different circumstances, growing with supernatural speed to lengths that suggested months of careful cultivation. Dumbledore's amused response to their predicament was delivered with the kind of gentle mockery that acknowledged their creativity while emphasizing the futility of their attempt, though his compliment about the magnificence of their beards suggested genuine appreciation for the unintended consequences of their magical experiment. His direction to report to the hospital wing was both practical medical advice and tacit acknowledgement that their punishment was sufficient without requiring additional disciplinary action. The laughter that greeted their spectacular failure was good-natured rather than cruel, reflecting their fellow students' appreciation for their willingness to attempt something that others had only contemplated, while demonstrating that failure could be entertaining when approached with appropriate humor and grace. Their own laughter at their appearance showed their ability to find amusement in setbacks while maintaining the kind of resilience that would serve them well during future challenges. The hospital wing visit provided them with practical education about magical beard removal, while allowing them to recover from their experiment in relative privacy, though Lee Jordan's continued presence ensured that their dignity remained thoroughly compromised by his persistent amusement at their transformed appearance. Madame Pomfrey's treatment was both effective and accompanied by the kind of stern lecture about student safety that they had learned to endure with appropriate expressions of contrition. Their philosophical acceptance of their failure was characteristic of their approach to setbacks throughout their lives, treating disappointments as learning experiences rather than personal defeats while maintaining optimism about future opportunities for success. Fred's expressed hope that Angelina Johnson might be selected as Hogwarts champion reflected both his confidence in her abilities and his continued investment in their house's success, even though their own participation had been eliminated. The selection of Cedric Diggory as Hogwarts champion was met with mixed emotions that reflected their complicated relationship with the Hufflepuff Seeker, whose victory over Harry during the previous year's Dementor-affected match had cost Gryffindor the Quidditch Cup. Their respect for his abilities was grudging but genuine, acknowledging his qualifications while maintaining their loyalty to their own house and their preference for outcomes that would benefit their friends rather than their competitors. Harry's unexpected selection as a fourth champion created the kind of controversy that Fred and George found both fascinating and concerning, understanding that his participation was clearly unauthorized. While recognizing that the magical contract-binding tournament participants would make withdrawal impossible, regardless of the circumstances that had led to his involvement. Their reaction combined surprise, pride, and worry in proportions that reflected their complex relationship with their famous friend. Their accusation that Harry should have shared his method for circumventing the age line was delivered with the kind of mock indignation that characterized their approach to most situations involving hurt feelings, though their genuine curiosity about his technique suggested real interest in learning from his apparent success where they had failed. The possibility that his selection had occurred through means other than personal initiative would require time and investigation to understand fully. The celebration they organized following Harry's successful completion of the first task was both recognition of his achievement and expression of their natural inclination toward parties whenever circumstances provided reasonable justification for festivities. The food they acquired from the kitchens was obtained through methods they had perfected over years of unauthorized culinary expeditions, demonstrating their continuing ability to navigate the castle's hidden passages despite increased security measures surrounding the tournament. Hermione's questions about their kitchen access were met with appropriate discretion about their specific techniques, while providing sufficient information to satisfy her curiosity about the portrait entrance and its activation. Requirements. Though Fred's suspicious inquiry about her motivations reflected their growing awareness that information about their methods could be used in ways that might not align with their own interests. Their warning against including wage-related propaganda in her house elf liberation efforts showed their understanding of the political complexities involved in attempts at social reform. The canary creams that transformed Neville into a giant bird were among their most successful product demonstrations to date, combining visual spectacle with reversible transformation that provided entertainment without causing permanent harm to volunteer test subjects. The 7 sickles price they announced for each cream reflected their growing confidence in the commercial viability of their products, while establishing a precedent for the pricing structure they would need to develop for their future business operations. The Yule Ball announcement created social pressures that Fred and George navigated with characteristic directness, approaching the task of finding dates with the same practical efficiency they applied to most challenges, while avoiding the kind of romantic anxiety that plagued many of their classmates. Fred's public invitation to Angelina Johnson across the common room was both bold and effective, demonstrating that confidence and straightforward communication often produced better results than elaborate courtship rituals. The success of their canary cream sales following the Yule Ball announcement showed their ability to capitalize on social events that created demand for their products. Though George's hints about additional items under development suggested that their experimental work was producing a steady stream of innovations that would require careful testing before being released to their expanding customer base. The balance between innovation and safety remained a constant consideration in their product development process. The dance floor performance that Fred and Angelina delivered during the Yule Ball was energetic enough to require other dancers to maintain safe distances, combining enthusiasm with skill in ways that created entertainment for observers while providing genuine enjoyment for the participants themselves. Their approach to formal social events remained characteristically unconventional, prioritizing fun over dignity while managing to avoid causing actual disruption to other attendees' enjoyment. Their continued pursuit of Ludo Bagman for the money he owed them demonstrated persistence in the face of official indifference while revealing their growing sophistication about adult corruption and the methods that unscrupulous individuals used to avoid honoring their obligations. The conversations they attempted to initiate with him in various locations showed their understanding that public pressure might succeed where private appeals had failed. The blackmail letter that George drafted represented a significant escalation in their conflict resolution strategy, though Fred's concerns about the legal implications of putting such accusations in writing reflected their awareness that their methods were approaching boundaries that could result in serious consequences for themselves rather than justice for their grievances. The tension between effective action and legal safety would continue to complicate their decision-making as they matured into adults, with more to lose from official retaliation. Their coming of age on April 1st was celebrated with the kind of quiet satisfaction that accompanied major life milestones, marking their transition from magical childhood to adult status with the rights and responsibilities that such recognition entailed. The apparition licenses they earned immediately demonstrated both their competence with advanced magic and their eagerness to embrace the freedoms that legal adulthood provided, though their parents' reaction to their new mobility was complicated by concerns about their judgment and safety. The support they provided to Harry during the third task was both emotional and practical, understanding that his participation in the tournament had exposed him to dangers that exceeded anything they had faced during their own school adventures, while recognizing that their presence could provide comfort even when they were unable to offer more substantial assistance. The outcome of the task would have consequences that extended far beyond tournament results. though they could not have anticipated the full scope of the tragedy that would unfold. Mrs. Weasley and Bill's visit to support Harry during the tournament finale provided Fred and George with opportunities to demonstrate their maturation while enjoying family time that had become increasingly precious as their paths diverged from their parents' expectations about appropriate career choices. The conversations they had with their older brother about their business plans were both seeking approval and sharing excitement about their future prospects. The final confrontation with Bagman that revealed his financial difficulties and dishonest character was both disappointing and educational, teaching them about the varieties of adult failure while confirming their growing understanding that official positions and respectable appearances could conceal fundamental moral deficiencies. Their decision to abandon pursuit of their money reflected practical recognition that further effort would be futile rather than forgiveness of his deceptive behavior. The train journey home provided opportunities for the kind of casual heroism that characterized their response to most emergencies, as their coordinated spellcasting with Harry, Ron, and Hermione to subdue Malfoy and his companions demonstrated both their combat skills and their loyalty to friends who were threatened by political enemies with dangerous ambitions. The effectiveness of their teamwork suggested capabilities that would serve them well during the more serious conflicts that lay ahead. Harry's gift of his tournament winnings was both generous beyond measure and practical recognition that their business plans deserved support from someone who understood the value of entrepreneurial independence and creative risk-taking. Their initial reluctance to accept such a substantial sum reflected their pride and their awareness of the sacrifice that Harry was making, though their eventual acceptance was motivated by understanding that refusing his generosity would be more hurtful than accepting it gracefully. The promise they made to avoid telling Mrs. Weasley about the source of their startup capital was both practical necessity and recognition that some family relationships required careful management of information to avoid conflicts that would benefit no one while potentially damaging bonds that remained important despite philosophical differences. Their business venture would proceed with or without family approval, but maintaining family harmony would require diplomatic discretion about certain details of their financial arrangements. The summer that followed Harry's gift was spent in intensive preparation for the business launch that would transform their lives from students with entrepreneurial dreams into professional inventors and retailers whose success would depend on their ability to create products that customers valued sufficiently to pay prices that would support profitable operations. The challenges ahead were substantial, but their confidence was based on years of experimentation and market research that had convinced them their vision was both achievable and financially viable. The 5th year at Hogwarts arrived shrouded in an atmosphere of oppression that seemed to permeate every stone of the ancient castle. As the Ministry of Magic's increasing interference in educational affairs had culminated in the appointment of Dolores Umbridge as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, a position that granted her unprecedented authority to reshape the school according to her own rigid vision of proper magical instruction. Her presence in the Great Hall during the opening feast was like a splash of offensive pink against the traditional Gothic grandeur of Hogwarts, her girlish giggle and saccharine smile masking an authoritarian nature that would soon reveal itself through actions far more sinister than her appearance suggested. Fred and George recognized the threat that Umbridge represented from their first encounter with her teaching methods, understanding instinctively that her approach to education was designed to produce compliant citizens rather than competent witches and wizards, and that her definition of appropriate student behavior would inevitably conflict with their own commitment to creative exploration and intellectual independence. The detentions she began assigning within days of the term's beginning were conducted with cruelty that exceeded anything they had experienced during their previous years at Hogwarts, involving not merely tedious tasks or loss of privileges, but actual physical torture, disguised as character improvement. The special quill that she used during these detention sessions was a masterpiece of vindictive innovation, enchanted to carve the lines that students were required to write directly into their own flesh using their own blood as ink, creating wounds that healed slowly and left permanent scars that would serve as lasting reminders of the price of disobedience to her authority. Fred and George endured these sessions with stoic determination, understanding that displaying pain or requesting mercy would only encourage her to extend their suffering, while providing her with the kind of psychological satisfaction that motivated her sadistic approach to discipline. The notice they posted in the Gryffindor common room recruiting volunteer test subjects for their experimental products was both practical market research and defiant response to the increasingly restrictive atmosphere that Umbridge was creating throughout the school, though Hermione's intervention as a prefect forced them to remove the advertisement before they could gather sufficient data about student interest in their developing product line. Her objection to their methods reflected genuine concern for their volunteers' safety, but also demonstrated the kind of rule-following mentality that made effective resistance to tyrannical authority difficult to organize and sustain. Their decision to continue with their testing program using more discreet methods was both practical necessity and philosophical statement about the importance of pursuing meaningful work regardless of official disapproval, though they were careful to ensure that their experiments were conducted safely and with appropriate consent from participants who understood the risks involved. The first-year students who volunteered for these trials were both brave and desperate for any form of entertainment that might provide relief from the grinding oppression of Umbridge's regime. The fainting fancies that they distributed during one evening's testing session worked exactly as intended, producing temporary unconsciousness that was both convincing and reversible, though Hermione's horrified reaction to seeing young students collapse simultaneously in the common room reflected her incomplete understanding of the sophisticated safety measures that Fred and George had built into their products. After years of using themselves as test subjects for far more dangerous experiments, their mockery of Hermione's threat to write to their mother was delivered with genuine amusement at her faith in parental authority as a solution to problems that required more immediate and creative responses, though they understood that her concern for student safety was sincere even if her proposed solutions were inadequate for the complex challenges they were facing. The decision to move their testing operations outside the common room was tactical adaptation rather than admission of wrongdoing, ensuring that their important work could continue without creating additional conflicts with well-meaning but misguided authority figures. Ron's addition to the Quidditch team as their new keeper provided both opportunity for family bonding and source of frustration, as his lack of confidence created performance problems that affected the entire team's morale and effectiveness. Though Fred and George were careful to avoid criticism that might damage his fragile self-esteem while he adapted to the pressures of competitive play at the house level, their supportive silence when he made obvious mistakes during practice sessions reflected their understanding that encouragement was more valuable than technical critique when dealing with athletes whose primary obstacles were psychological rather than physical. The incident with Katie Bell and the nosebleed nougat demonstrated both the effectiveness of their product and the importance of proper usage instructions, as Fred's accidental administration of the wrong end of the sweet created a medical emergency that required immediate intervention to prevent serious blood loss. Their swift response in transporting Katie to the hospital wing showed their acceptance of responsibility for problems caused by their products, while reinforcing their commitment to ensuring that their innovations were safe when used correctly. The meeting in Hogsmeade that led to the formation of Dumbledore's army was attended by Fred and George with enthusiasm that reflected both their desire to learn practical defensive magic and their recognition that organized resistance to Umbridge's regime was essential for preserving any meaningful education during their final years at Hogwarts. Their financial contribution to the gathering, purchasing butterbeer for all attendees, demonstrated their commitment to the group's success, while providing tangible support for Harry's willingness to share his knowledge with fellow students. George's threat to Zachariah Smith with a long, lethal-looking metal instrument was both effective intimidation and practical demonstration of their readiness to defend the group against members whose attitude might undermine morale or compromise security, though the violence implicit in the gesture was carefully calibrated to discourage bad behavior without causing actual harm to someone whose participation was ultimately valuable, despite his personality defects. Their signatures on the membership list were among the first offered, reflecting both their immediate commitment to the organization and their confidence in Harry's ability to provide the kind of instruction that the official curriculum was deliberately failing to deliver, though they understood that their participation would require careful balancing of Defense Association activities with their own business development and the academic work necessary to complete their Hogwarts education successfully. The skiving snack box demonstrations they conducted in the common room were both entertainment for their fellow students and sophisticated marketing presentations that allowed them to gather orders while building anticipation for their products among customers who would soon be able to purchase the sweets through mail order services that would extend their reach far beyond the Hogwarts student body. The enthusiastic response from their audience validated years of development work while providing evidence that their business model was financially viable. The debate about using puking pastilles to escape Quidditch practice in unpleasant weather reflected their growing sophistication about balancing competing priorities, weighing their desire to avoid uncomfortable conditions against their loyalty to their teammates and their understanding that Angelina would recognize their deception based on her familiarity with their product line. George's suggestion of fever fudge as an alternative demonstrated their comprehensive understanding of their inventory, while acknowledging that some products remained imperfect enough to create problems for users. The side effects that Fred and George experienced from testing their fever fudge were both educational about product development challenges and reminder of the personal costs involved in their commitment to creating safe and effective marchandises, though their willingness to endure painful consequences for the sake of perfecting their formulas demonstrated the kind of dedication that would be essential for long-term business success. The boils that made flying uncomfortable were temporary inconvenience rather than permanent damage, but they served as motivation for continued refinement of their manufacturing processes. The Dumbledore's army meetings in the Room of Requirement provided Fred and George with opportunities to develop defensive skills that went far beyond anything they had learned in regular defense against the dark arts classes, though their natural inclination toward mischief sometimes interfered with the serious atmosphere that effective combat training required. Their prank on Zachariah Smith, disarming him whenever he opened his mouth, was both technically impressive and tactically counterproductive, though their apology when caught demonstrated their ability to recognize when humor was inappropriate for the situation at hand. The Quidditch match against Slytherin that nearly resulted in violence was transformed from athletic competition into personal conflict, when Draco Malfoy's insults targeted the Weasley family's financial circumstances and character, creating provocations that went far beyond acceptable trash talk between opposing teams. Fred and George's restraint in the face of these attacks demonstrated remarkable self-control, though their dirty looks made their feelings clear, while their compliance with Angelina's orders showed their respect for team leadership, even in emotionally charged situations. The explosion of violence that followed Malfoy's insult to Harry's deceased mother was both inevitable and justified, though the coordinated assault that George and Harry delivered was severe enough to leave their target curled up on the ground, whimpering and moaning in ways that suggested the beating had been more thorough than strictly necessary for making their point about acceptable boundaries in inter-house conflicts. George's swollen lip, evidence of Malfoy's desperate attempts at self-defense during the beating, was worn with the kind of pride that came from defending family honor against someone whose privileged background had never prepared him for the consequences of deliberately provocative behavior, though the injury also served as reminder that even justified violence carried costs for those who administered it, as well as those who received it. The punishments that Professor McGonagall administered for the fight were appropriately severe, reflecting both her disapproval of violence and her understanding that student conflicts needed to be addressed through official channels rather than personal retaliation, though her obvious sympathy for their motivations was evident in her restrained response to behavior that could have justified much harsher consequences under different circumstances. Umbridge's additional punishments, including lifetime bans from Quidditch for all 3 participants and confiscation of their broomsticks, were vindictive overreach that exceeded any reasonable response to student fighting while revealing her willingness to use her authority for personal satisfaction rather than educational purposes. The ban on Fred, despite his lack of actual participation in the violence, was a particularly egregious example of collective punishment that violated basic principles of justice and fairness. The team's reaction to these punishments was a mixture of outrage at their unfairness and resignation to the reality that Umbridge's power made appeal impossible, though Katie's observation about the injustice of punishing Fred for violence he hadn't committed reflected the broader student body's growing awareness that their educational environment had become actively hostile to student welfare and institutional fairness. Fred's response that he would have pounded the little scumbag to a pulp if given the opportunity was both honest acknowledgement of his violent impulses and explanation of why Umbridge's reasoning, however flawed, was not entirely without basis in his actual intentions, though the punishment remained disproportionate to actions that had been prevented rather than committed. Their adaptation to the Quidditch ban involved channeling their frustrated energy into more elaborate pranks and product demonstrations, including the snowball enchantments that targeted other students and prefects with the kind of precision that required sophisticated magical control, though Ron's protests about their violations of school rules were met with direct physical retaliation that reminded him of the limitations of his authority as prefect when dealing with brothers who had no respect for official positions. The Christmas crisis that brought news of Arthur Weasley's attack provided Fred and George with their first real understanding of the personal costs that their parents were paying for their involvement with the Order of the Populace. Phoenix, transforming abstract knowledge about dangerous times into immediate fear for their father's life and their family's stability. The Portkey journey to Grimmauld Place was conducted in stunned silence as they processed the implications of Harry's vision and tried to prepare themselves for whatever news awaited them. The confrontation with Sirius about visiting their father in Street, Mungos reflected their natural desire to be with family during crisis while revealing their frustration with being treated as children when their emotional needs were those of young adults who deserved inclusion in important family decisions. Sirius's reminder about order security and the dangers that members accepted was both educational about adult responsibilities and frustrating acknowledgement that their youth excluded them from full participation in the resistance efforts. Fred's angry accusation that Sirius spent his time stuck here and didn't see him risking his neck was both unfair personal attack and accurate observation about the differences between theoretical commitment and active service, though it reflected the kind of emotional stress that crisis created rather than considered judgment about Sirius's character or contributions to their cause. The apology that followed showed their ability to recognize when grief had led them to say things that were hurtful rather than helpful. The relief that flooded through them when their mother's message confirmed that Arthur would survive was so intense that it temporarily overwhelmed their capacity for normal emotional responses, leaving Fred slumped in his chair with hands covering his face while George sought physical comfort through embracing their mother. The vigil that had consumed their night had prepared them for the worst possible news, making their father's survival feel like miraculous reprieve rather than expected outcome. The hospital visits that followed provided opportunities to spend time with their father while he recovered from injuries that had been both life-threatening and mysterious in their magical nature, though the explanations about snake attacks and their connection to Voldemort's return created additional anxieties about the broader conflict that was developing around them. Their father's assurances about his condition were both comforting and insufficient for alleviating fears about future attacks on family members who were actively opposing dark forces. The Christmas celebration at Grimmauld Place was subdued by their father's absence and their mother's grief about Percy's estrangement from the family, though Fred and George's attempts to comfort her were motivated by genuine love. Despite their limited understanding of the complex emotions involved in watching adult children make choices that seemed to reject everything their parents had tried to teach them about loyalty and family commitment. Their demonstration of headless hats in the common room was both product showcase and technical achievement that impressed even Hermione with its magical sophistication, though her compliment about the difficulty of the magic involved was recognition of their growing capabilities rather than endorsement of their business activities, which she continued to view as distraction from more important academic and political concerns. The observation they shared with Harry and Hermione about Quidditch being the only thing worth staying at Hogwarts for reflected their growing disillusionment with the educational environment that Umbridge had created, though their dismissive attitude toward NEWT examinations showed incomplete understanding of how these qualifications might affect their future opportunities, even in entrepreneurial careers that seemed independent of conventional credentials. Their assault on Montague, pushing him into the Vanishing Cabinet before he could dock house points, was both tactical victory and escalation of their conflict with Umbridge's regime that demonstrated their readiness to use violence against authority figures who threatened their interests or those of their fellow students. The laughter with which they discussed Montague's uncertain fate showed their diminished concern about consequences for their enemies, though they remained careful to avoid actions that might result in permanent harm to people who were merely annoying rather than actively malicious. The distinction they drew between putting a toe across the line occasionally and causing real mayhem reflected their understanding that their previous pranks had been relatively harmless expressions of creativity, rather than genuine rebellion against institutional authority, though their determination to engage in serious disruption now that Dumbledore had been removed showed their recognition that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses. Hermione's warning about possible expulsion was met with laughter that demonstrated their genuine indifference to remaining at Hogwarts under current conditions, though their commitment to do their bit for Dumbledore first showed that their rebellion was motivated by loyalty rather than simple destructiveness, and that they understood the difference between personal vendetta and principled resistance to tyranny. The Weasleys' wildfire whiz-bangs that they unleashed throughout the castle were masterpieces of magical pyrotechnics that had been designed specifically to resist conventional countermeasures while providing maximum entertainment value for students who desperately needed relief from the oppressive atmosphere that Umbridge had created. The fireworks gained energy and momentum rather than fading when attacked, demonstrating sophisticated enchantments that turned attempts at suppression into fuel for continued spectacular displays. Umbridge's futile efforts to control the fireworks throughout the day provided exactly the kind of public humiliation that their plan had been designed to create, showing the entire school that her authority was not absolute, and that creative resistance could achieve victories that direct confrontation could never accomplish. The multiplication effect that occurred when she tried to vanish the fireworks was particularly satisfying demonstration of their technical superiority over someone whose power was based on position rather than competence. The heroes' welcome they received in the Gryffindor common room that evening was both recognition of their achievement and validation of their decision to prioritize student morale over their own academic standing. Though even Hermione's admission that the fireworks were wonderful represented significant acknowledgement from someone who had previously disapproved of their disruptive activities. The waiting list that formed for people wanting to purchase their fireworks demonstrated the commercial potential of products that served both entertainment and political purposes. Though their decision to use their entire stock for this single demonstration showed their commitment to the cause over immediate profit. Understanding that some victories were worth more than money, the final confrontation with Umbridge occurred when she cornered them with a crowd of students watching, creating exactly the kind of public forum that their escape plan required for maximum symbolic impact on the student body that would remain behind to deal with her continued authority. Her threats of corporal punishment were both illegal and indicative of how completely she had abandoned any pretense of educational mission in favor of personal vendettas against students who had successfully challenged her power. Fred's calm observation that their situation was amusing demonstrated his complete lack of fear in the face of her threats, while their announcement that they had outgrown full-time education represented both practical assessment of their readiness for independent careers and philosophical statement about the limitations of institutional learning when institutions had been corrupted by political interference. Their summoning of their broomsticks from Umbridge's office was both practical necessity for their escape and dramatic gesture that demonstrated their magical capabilities to an audience that needed to understand that student resistance was not merely symbolic, but represented real power that could challenge established authority when circumstances made such challenges necessary. The farewell speech they delivered to their fellow students was both advertising for their future business and encouragement for continued resistance to tyrannical authority, providing practical information about where to find their products while establishing their new shop as symbol of successful escape from the system that was failing to serve student needs or prepare young people for the challenges they would face in the wider magical world. Their instruction to Peeves to give her hell was both practical delegation of harassment responsibilities and symbolic passing of the torch to a spirit whose commitment to chaos was even more fundamental than their own, ensuring that their departure would not end the disruption that was essential for maintaining student morale under impossible conditions. The flight from Hogwarts was both triumphant escape and bittersweet farewell to the place that had been their home for nearly 6 years, though the applause that followed their departure confirmed that they had achieved their goal of inspiring other students to continue resisting authority that had abandoned any commitment to education in favor of political control and personal vindictiveness. The swamp they left behind in the corridor became both practical obstacle for Umbridge's movement through the castle and permanent monument to their ingenuity and commitment to student welfare, remaining in place for months after their departure, as a reminder that creative resistance could achieve lasting victories against those who mistook temporary authority for permanent power. The legend status they achieved through their spectacular departure would endure long after they had graduated and established successful careers, inspiring future generations of students to understand that some forms of authority deserved respect, while others required opposition and that young people who were willing to take calculated risks could sometimes achieve changes that adults with greater resources and official positions could not accomplish through conventional means. The establishment of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes at number 93 Diagon Alley represented the culmination of years of experimentation, planning, and dreaming, transforming from adolescent fantasy into tangible reality through a combination of Harry Potter's generous investment, their own innovative genius, and the kind of desperate determination that comes from understanding that failure would mean accepting conventional careers that held no appeal for young men whose talents lay in directions that traditional employment could never accommodate or reward appropriately. The shop itself was a testament to their understanding that successful retail required more than simply having products to sell, demanding the creation of an environment that would draw customers inside, while providing experiences that justified premium prices for items that might seem frivolous to adults who had forgotten the importance of laughter in their daily lives. The exterior facade was designed to stand out dramatically against the increasingly drab appearance of Diagon Alley during these troubled times, using colors and magical effects that created the impression of perpetual celebration. Even when the surrounding businesses reflected the fear and uncertainty that characterized the magical community's response to Voldemort's return. The interior layout had been planned with the same attention to detail they had once applied to navigating Hogwarts' secret passages, creating traffic flows that would expose customers to their entire inventory while providing spaces for demonstration and interaction that would encourage impulse purchases and repeat visits. Every shelf, display case, and demonstration area had been positioned to maximize both visual impact and practical functionality, ensuring that customers could easily find what they were looking for, while discovering additional items that they hadn't known they needed until they saw them in action. Their product line had expanded far beyond the skiving snack boxes that had funded their initial development, encompassing a comprehensive range of magical novelties, practical jokes, and defensive items that served markets ranging from homesick Hogwarts students to ministry employees whose work required protection from increasingly sophisticated dark arts attacks. The canary creams that had been among their earliest successes were now manufactured in quantities that could supply demand throughout magical Britain, while new innovations continued to emerge from their workshop with the regularity that suggested their creative partnership had achieved sustainable productivity. The extendable ears that had proven so valuable for eavesdropping on order meetings had been refined into commercial products that could penetrate most privacy charms while remaining undetectable to casual observation, serving customers who needed intelligence-gathering capabilities for purposes both legitimate and questionable. The moral implications of selling surveillance equipment to unknown buyers had been debated between them at length, but their conclusion was that information was morally neutral and that responsible merchants could not be held accountable for customers' ethical choices regarding the use of legally purchased products. The decoy detonators that created diversions through realistic explosive sounds and lighting effects had found eager markets among students whose creativity in avoiding unwanted obligations exceeded their access to sophisticated magical tools, though the warnings they included with each purchase reflected their understanding that even harmless pranks could have serious consequences when used inappropriately or without consideration for innocent bystanders who might be frightened or inconvenienced by unexpected magical effects. But it was their development of defensive products that demonstrated their evolution from entertainers into serious magical innovators whose work addressed genuine needs created by the deteriorating security situation throughout the first wizarding world. The shield hats that had begun as jokes about the difficulties of casting proper shield charms had proven so effective that the ministry itself had become their largest customer, purchasing hundreds of units for field operatives whose survival might depend on protection that could be activated instantly without requiring conscious spell casting under combat conditions. The success of their shield hats had led to contracts for additional defensive items, including cloaks, gloves, and boots that provided comprehensive protection against most common attack spells, while remaining comfortable enough for extended wear during normal activities. The magical engineering required to create clothing that could absorb and redirect hostile magic without interfering with the wearer's own spellcasting had pushed their technical skills to new levels, requiring innovations in enchantment layering and energy management that had applications extending far beyond personal protection equipment. The instant darkness powder that created impenetrable shadows for escape and evasion had been developed through careful study of naturally occurring magical phenomena, replicating the effects of certain rare minerals through artificial means that could be manufactured consistently and sold at prices that made the product accessible to customers with modest budgets. The powder's effectiveness had been tested under realistic conditions that included attempts by experienced auras to penetrate the darkness using standard counter-illumination spells, ensuring that their claims about the product's capabilities were supported by objective evidence rather than optimistic speculation. The headless hats that made wearers appear decapitated were technically impressive achievements that had required solving complex problems in illusion magic and spatial perception, though their primary market remained entertainment rather than practical applications, serving customers who appreciated sophisticated magical effects for their own sake rather than any specific utilitarian purpose. The manufacturing process had been refined to the point where each hat could be produced reliably with consistent quality, though the magical complexity involved meant that prices remained higher than simple novelty items could normally command. The Wonder Witch product line that they had developed to serve female customers reflected their understanding that successful businesses needed to address diverse market segments rather than focusing exclusively on the teenage male demographic that had been their initial customer base. The love potions they offered were carefully formulated to create temporary infatuation rather than genuine emotional manipulation, with effects that wore off naturally without causing lasting psychological damage to either the user or the target of their romantic interests. Ginny's examination of their love potion display during the family's first visit to the shop had provided opportunities for gentle teasing about her own romantic situation, while demonstrating their product's appeal to customers whose needs extended beyond simple entertainment toward addressing real social challenges that many young people faced during their transition from adolescence to adult relationships. Their assurance that she didn't need artificial assistance with her love life was both brotherly affection and accurate assessment of her natural attractiveness and social competence. The pygmy puffs that had become their most popular pets were breeding faster than they could supply demand, creating pleasant problems about production scaling and inventory management that reflected their success in identifying market needs that competitors had overlooked or been unable to serve effectively. The creatures themselves were adorable enough to appeal to customers of all ages while being hardy enough to survive in various living environments without requiring specialized care that might discourage potential buyers who lacked experience with magical creature husbandry. The staff they had hired to manage daily operations while they focused on product development and strategic planning were carefully selected for both competence and compatibility with their business culture, understanding that employees who couldn't appreciate humor and creativity would be unsuitable for representing their brand to customers who expected entertainment along with their purchases. The training program they had developed ensured that all staff members could demonstrate products effectively while maintaining the atmosphere of controlled chaos that made shopping at their store an experience rather than simply a transaction. Their decision to live in the flat above the shop reflected both practical financial considerations and their commitment to remaining closely involved with their business, rather than treating it as passive investment that could be managed by others. Though the arrangement also provided convenient access to their workshop during the late-night creative sessions, when their best innovations often emerged from exhausted minds that had moved beyond conventional thinking into genuinely original territory. The conversion of their childhood bedroom at the Burrow into storage space for their business inventory had been accomplished with their parents' grudging permission, transforming the site of years of explosive experiments into a proper warehouse that could accommodate the growing volume of products that required temporary storage between manufacturing and distribution to retail and mail order. Customers throughout magical Britain, and increasingly in international markets that had begun requesting access to their innovations. The mail order service they had established was both practical necessity for reaching customers outside London and strategic advantage that allowed them to build relationships with clients who might never have the opportunity to visit their physical store, but whose loyalty could be maintained through reliable service and consistent product quality. The OWL delivery network they had developed could handle orders throughout Britain within 24 hours, while maintaining packaging standards that ensured fragile items arrived undamaged and ready for immediate use. The advertising campaign they had launched in the Daily Prophet had been carefully designed to appeal to adult readers, while maintaining the playful image that attracted younger customers, balancing respectability with irreverence in ways that suggested their products were both fun and professionally manufactured. The response to their advertisements had exceeded their most optimistic projections, requiring rapid expansion of their manufacturing capabilities and customer service infrastructure to handle demand that seemed to grow exponentially as word spread about their innovations. Their success had attracted attention from competitors who attempted to copy their products with varying degrees of effectiveness, though most imitators lacked both the technical expertise and creative vision necessary to reproduce the sophisticated enchantments that made genuine Weasley products superior to cheaper alternatives. The magical signatures that they embedded in their authentic merchandise served both as anti-counterfeiting measures and quality guarantees that customers could verify before making purchases that represented significant investments in their entertainment budgets. The family's reaction to their commercial success had evolved from skeptical concern to grudging admiration as the evidence accumulated that their unconventional career choice was generating substantial profits while providing valuable services to customers who genuinely appreciated their contributions to magical commerce. Even Mrs. Weasley, whose initial horror at their departure from Hogwarts had been motivated by maternal concern about their future security, had been forced to acknowledge that their business acumen exceeded her expectations and that their success reflected genuine talent rather than adolescent rebellion. Arthur's fascination with their technical innovations had provided opportunities for father-son bonding that had been impossible when their interests seemed to have no practical applications, though his pride in their achievements was complicated by his awareness that their defensive products were selling primarily because of the dangerous times that required ordinary citizens to prepare for attacks that previous generations had never needed to consider. The visit that their family made to inspect their establishment was both celebration of their success and opportunity to demonstrate how completely they had transformed their lives through determination and creative risk-taking. Though the underlying tensions about their departure from conventional educational paths remained unresolved, despite the obvious evidence of their prosperity and professional competence. Harry's tour of their facilities was conducted with the pride that comes from being able to share achievements with someone whose support had been essential for making dreams into reality. though their insistence that he could help himself to anything he wanted reflected genuine gratitude rather than mere politeness. Understanding that his investment had been more than financial contribution, but expression of faith in their potential when others had been skeptical about their prospects for success. The back room where they conducted their most sensitive research and development work was off-limits to most visitors, containing prototypes and experimental materials that represented months or years of investigation into magical principles that had commercial applications but also potential for misuse if the knowledge fell into inappropriate hands. The security measures they had installed to protect their intellectual property were as sophisticated as anything used by established magical corporations, reflecting their understanding that business success required protecting competitive advantages that could be lost through industrial espionage or casual disclosure. The Wonder Witch section, that had been designed specifically for female customers, represented their growing sophistication about market segmentation and targeted product development, though their approach to marketing, love potions, and beauty enhancement items required careful attention to both legal regulations and ethical considerations about products that could affect people's emotions and self-perception in potentially harmful ways. The conversation they had with Ginny about her romantic life was both natural brotherly interest and professional curiosity about their target demographic's actual needs and preferences, though their suggestion that she didn't require artificial assistance with dating was accurate assessment of her natural attractiveness and social confidence, rather than mere familial loyalty to someone they had watched grow from annoying little sister into competent young woman with her own romantic prospects. The ban that Argus Filch had imposed on all Weasley's Wizard Wheezes products at Hogwarts was both recognition of their effectiveness and source of frustration about lost market opportunities, though their development of the Owl Order service that disguised their products as legitimate goods had demonstrated the same creative problem-solving abilities that had characterized their approach to institutional obstacles throughout their school careers. The disguised packages that they sent to Hogwarts students were masterpieces of deceptive labeling that could pass casual inspection while containing their full range of products, using perfume bottles, cough potion containers, and other innocent-looking receptacles that aroused no suspicion from authority figures who were focused on preventing obvious contraband rather than conducting detailed chemical analysis of every package that arrived for students. The Christmas visit they made to the Burrow provided opportunities for family bonding while allowing them to observe the changes that had occurred in their absence. Though the tension surrounding Percy's estrangement from the family created undercurrents of sadness that complicated what should have been purely celebratory occasions focused on their success and the family's general well-being during difficult times. Their decoration of the Christmas tree with the stunned gnome was typical of their approach to holiday traditions, combining respect for family customs with irreverent humor that reflected their personalities while creating memories that would be discussed for years to come. Though Mrs. Weasley's tolerance for their creative interpretations of appropriate behavior had been enhanced by her pride in their business success and her relief that they were thriving despite their unconventional choices. The teasing they directed toward Ron about his romantic relationship with Lavender Brown was both normal sibling behavior and expression of their genuine interest in his happiness, though their suggestion that extensive brain damage might explain her attraction to him was more affectionate mockery than serious criticism of either party's judgment in matters that were ultimately their own concern. Their inquiry about Percy's potential appearance at family gatherings was motivated by hope for reconciliation rather than desire for confrontation, though Fred's characterization of their estranged brother as the world's biggest prat reflected genuine anger about his choice to prioritize ministry politics over family loyalty during times when such loyalty was essential for emotional survival. The pretty muggle girl they mentioned entertaining was both evidence of their expanding social circle and demonstration of their comfort with non-magical people whose appreciation for their abilities was enhanced by their emodi's lack of familiarity with the wizarding world's conventional attitudes toward magical entertainment and novelty items. The diamond-encrusted hat they gave their mother for Christmas was both generous expression of their affection and practical demonstration of their ability to afford luxuries that their family's previous financial circumstances had made impossible, though the gift also reflected their understanding that material success was meaningless unless it could be shared with people whose happiness mattered more than personal achievement. Percy's appearance at the Burrow with the Minister of Magic was both family reunion and political manipulation that created awkward situations for everyone present, though the food-throwing response from Fred, George, and Ginny was both appropriate expression of their feelings and effective method for ending the visit before it could develop into more serious confrontation. The Hogsmeade visit they made for Ron's birthday represented their continuing connection to their school years while providing business opportunities to explore potential expansion into the village's commercial district, though the Zonko's property they were considering purchasing would require significant investment and renovation to meet their standards for retail presentation and workshop functionality. Ron's poisoning created family crisis that reminded them how quickly normal life could be disrupted by events beyond anyone's control. Though their hospital visit was both expression of brotherly concern and demonstration of their ability to maintain family relationships despite their physical absence from the Burrow and their involvement in business activities that kept them occupied with adult responsibilities. The joke they made about their birthday present to Ron being delivered under circumstances they hadn't anticipated reflected their ability to find humor even in serious situations, though their underlying worry about his condition was evident in their uncharacteristic subdued behavior during what should have been celebration of his recovery and return to normal health. Their return to Hogwarts for Bill's wedding, despite the dangerous circumstances that surrounded any large gathering of Order members, demonstrated their commitment to family obligations that transcended personal safety considerations, though the attack that disrupted the ceremony provided stark reminder of how completely their world had changed since their school days, when such celebrations could be conducted without fear of Death Eater assault. Bill's injuries from his encounter with Greyback created additional family trauma that tested everyone's ability to maintain emotional stability during times when normal support systems were compromised by the wider conflict that affected every aspect of their lives. Though their relief at his survival was enhanced by the knowledge that his relationship with Fleur would continue despite the physical damage that had altered his appearance permanently. The joining of the Order of the Phoenix that summer marked their transition from observers of the adult world's conflicts to active participants in resistance activities that carried genuine risks of injury, capture, or death, though their decision to commit themselves fully to the fight against Voldemort was both natural evolution of their political beliefs and recognition that successful business operations would be impossible in a world controlled by Death Eater ideology. The summer of 1997 brought with it the kind of oppressive heat that seemed to press down upon the wizarding world like a physical manifestation of the fear and uncertainty that had settled over magical Britain since Voldemort's return to power. Though for Fred and George Weasley, the sweltering days were filled with the urgent preparations required for the most dangerous mission they had ever undertaken as members of the Order of the Phoenix. The plan to extract Harry Potter from his relative's house on Privet Drive was both tactically complex and emotionally significant, representing their first real opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the war effort, while demonstrating their commitment to protecting someone who had become as dear to them as their own siblings. The Seven Potters strategy that Alistair Moody had devised was characteristic of the legendary Auror's approach to dangerous operations, combining misdirection with overwhelming force while distributing risk among multiple participants who understood that their individual survival was secondary to the mission's success. The use of Polyjuice Potion to create multiple identical copies of Harry would force Voldemort and his followers to divide their attention among 7 equally plausible targets, increasing the chances that the real Harry would escape unharmed, while acknowledging that some of the decoys might not survive the encounter. Fred and George's participation in this mission was both natural extension of their protective instincts toward Harry and practical recognition that their magical abilities and flying skills made them valuable assets for operations, requiring precision and courage under extreme pressure. The transformation they would undergo through drinking Polyjuice Potion containing Harry's hair was both fascinating from a technical perspective and unsettling from a personal standpoint, as temporary loss of their individual identities felt like violation of the essential characteristics that define their partnership and their understanding of themselves. The brewing and distribution of the Polyjuice Potion was conducted with the kind of ceremonial solemnity that accompanied all truly important magical workings, though the practical aspects of the transformation process were both messy and uncomfortable in ways that reminded everyone present that powerful magic often exacted physical costs from those who employed it. The hair that Harry contributed for the potion was treated with appropriate reverence, understanding that his willingness to provide the means for their disguise represented both generosity and trust in their ability to use his identity responsibly. The gradual transformation that occurred as the potion took effect was both miraculous and disturbing. Watching familiar faces dissolve and reform into Harry's distinctive features, while personalities and memories remained unchanged beneath the altered physical appearance. Fred and George found themselves looking at perfect copies of their friend while maintaining their own thoughts and emotional responses, creating a form of identity confusion that was manageable only because they understood its temporary nature. The final briefing that Moody conducted before their departure was comprehensive in its attention to detail while acknowledging that no plan, however carefully crafted, could account for all possible contingencies that might arise during combat operations against enemies, whose capabilities and intentions could only be estimated rather than known with certainty. The routes they would take, the safe houses they would use, and the emergency procedures they should follow, if separated from their assigned protectors, were all memorized through repetition that ensured automatic responses even under the stress of battle. The assignment of protectors to each Harry duplicate was based on both practical considerations about flying ability and strategic thinking about enemy expectations, with the real Harry being paired with Hagrid specifically because Voldemort would anticipate that the most obvious choice would be avoided in favor of less predictable arrangements. Fred was assigned to fly with his father Arthur, while George would accompany Remus Lupin, pairings that reflected both their individual capabilities and the overall tactical requirements of the mission. The humor they maintained during these preparations was both coping mechanism for dealing with legitimate fear and expression of their natural personalities, understanding that laughter could provide emotional relief without diminishing their awareness of the serious dangers they were about to face. Their joke about Moody's inability to tell them apart even when they looked like Harry was characteristic of their approach to stress management, using familiar comedy routines to maintain psychological equilibrium during circumstances that might otherwise have been overwhelming. The takeoff from Privet Drive was conducted in formation that would have been impressive under normal circumstances, but became chaotic within moments, as the trap that awaited them revealed itself through the sudden appearance of death. Eaters who had anticipated their plan and prepared overwhelming, forced to counter it. The night sky that should have provided concealment instead became a battlefield where dark-cloaked figures materialized from concealment with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive preparation and intimate knowledge of Order operations. The realization that their mission had been compromised was both terrifying and educational, demonstrating that their enemies possessed intelligence capabilities that exceeded anything the Order had anticipated, while confirming their worst fears about the extent to which their organization had been penetrated by spies or surveillance methods that remained undetected despite their security precautions. The systematic nature of the ambush suggested that betrayal had occurred at high levels within their ranks, though immediate survival took precedence over investigating the source of their compromised security. Fred's flight with his father became a desperate race for survival as Death Eaters pursued them with single-minded determination that suggested they believed they were chasing the real Harry Potter rather than one of several decoys, though the attention they attracted was both flattering and terrifying evidence of their deception's effectiveness. Arthur's flying skills, while adequate for normal transportation, were tested beyond their limits by the demands of combat maneuvering against opponents who had no concern for civilian casualties or magical law enforcement. The spells that flew around them during their aerial battle created light, shows that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but represented deadly force that could kill or maim anyone unfortunate enough to be struck by the magical energy being unleashed with reckless abandon by combatants who understood that victory required eliminating their opponents permanently. The killing curses that flashed green against the darkness were particularly terrifying because they offered no possibility of recovery or healing for anyone they touched successfully. George's experience with Remus Lupin was equally harrowing, but complicated by different factors, as his assigned protector's werewolf nature created additional variables in combat situations that required careful management to avoid friendly fire incidents or tactical confusion that might compromise their escape from overwhelming enemy forces. Lupin's experience as a fighter was evident in his calm responses to crisis, but even veteran combatants could be overwhelmed when facing odds that exceeded reasonable expectations of survival. The Sectum Sempra curse that struck George was cast by Severus Snape, though neither victim nor witnesses could have identified the spell's origin during the confusion of battle, and its effects were both immediate and devastating in ways that transformed their escape from successful evasion into medical emergency, requiring immediate attention to prevent death from blood loss. The curse that severed George's ear was designed to cause maximum damage while ensuring that magical healing would be unable to restore what had been destroyed, leaving permanent disability as a reminder of the encounter. The pain that accompanied the loss of his ear was both physical agony and psychological shock as George processed the reality that he had been permanently altered by their first real combat experience, though his consciousness remained sufficiently intact to understand that survival was more important than mourning what had been lost during their escape from enemies who would certainly kill him if given the opportunity. Lupin's desperate efforts to maintain their flight path while supporting his wounded passenger required skills that exceeded normal flying ability. The landing at their designated safe house was accomplished through a combination of skill and luck that allowed them to reach Sanctuary before George's blood loss became fatal, though the portkey that transported them to the Burrow was activated only after confirming that they had not been followed by enemies who might use their escape route to track them to their family home where other Order members might be gathered for the mission's conclusion. The arrival at the Burrow was both relief at reaching safety and beginning of the medical crisis that would determine whether George's injuries were survivable or would result in permanent disability that might affect his ability to continue participating in the resistance activities that had become central to his identity and purpose. Harry's immediate assistance in carrying him inside demonstrated the kind of loyalty and concern that justified the risks they had taken to protect him during the extraction mission. The examination of George's wound by his mother revealed the full extent of the damage that Sectum Sempra had inflicted, showing that the ear had been completely severed rather than simply injured, and that the curse's effects included magical elements that would prevent normal healing processes from regenerating what had been destroyed. Mrs. Weasley's medical training was sufficient to stop the bleeding and prevent infection, but restoration of his hearing would require adjustments and accommodations that would affect him for the rest of his life. Fred's arrival with Arthur shortly after George had been stabilized provided emotional reunion that was complicated by the visible evidence of what the mission had cost them. Though his initial speechlessness reflected the difficulty of finding appropriate words for situations that exceeded normal experience and challenged conventional expressions of concern or comfort, the bond between the twins made George's injury feel like personal loss to Fred, who had never experienced physical pain that his brother had not shared. The joke that George made about being holy was both coping mechanism and demonstration that his essential personality had survived the trauma intact, though Fred's criticism of the pun's quality was affectionate response that helped restore some sense of normalcy to a situation that had been entirely outside their previous experience. The humor they shared was precious because it proved that their partnership could survive even permanent physical changes that might have destroyed other relationships. Mrs. Weasley's observation that she could finally tell them apart was delivered with the kind of maternal love that could find positive aspects in even tragic circumstances, though her relief that George had survived was evident in every gesture and expression as she processed the reality that she had come close to losing one of her children during their first major combat operation. The family's response to his injury was both celebration of his survival and mourning for what had been permanently lost. The wedding of Bill and Fleur that took place at the Burrow, despite the dangerous circumstances, was both celebration of love and defiant statement that normal human experiences would continue even during wartime, though the security precautions required for the ceremony demonstrated how completely their lives had been affected by the conflict that surrounded them. Fred and George's participation in the wedding was both family obligation and opportunity to demonstrate that their spirits had not been broken by their recent experiences. The Vila cousins who attended as part of Fleur's family provided both exotic glamour and practical complications for the wedding security, as their natural magical allure created emotional responses in male attendees that might interfere with their ability to maintain appropriate vigilance for threats that could materialize at any moment. Fred's competitive behavior in escorting the Vila guests was both natural masculine response and tactical error that left George to manage less glamorous responsibilities alone. The Death Eater attack that disrupted the wedding celebration was both predictable consequence of gathering so many Order members in one location and demonstration of how completely their enemies had penetrated the protective measures that should have prevented unauthorized access to family gatherings. The speed with which the festivities transformed into battle conditions showed how quickly normal life could become life-threatening crisis when magical conflicts escalated beyond political disagreement into active warfare. The interrogation that followed their capture was both terrifying and educational, providing their first direct experience with Death Eater methods, while demonstrating that their reputation as relatively minor Order members had provided some protection against the worst forms of torture that their enemies might have employed against more significant targets. The questions they were asked revealed both the extent and limitations of Death Eater intelligence about Order operations and membership. Their release after questioning was both relief and source of continuing anxiety about the surveillance that might follow them during their return to normal activities. understanding that their survival might have been purchased through agreements or assumptions that could place other Order members in danger if they failed to maintain appropriate security protocols during future operations. The freedom to return home felt conditional rather than permanent, given the political situation that continued to deteriorate around them. The period of hiding with Aunt Muriel was both protective custody and form of house arrest that prevented them from operating their business while ensuring their safety during a time when known Order affiliates were being systematically targeted for elimination or capture by Death Eater forces that had effective control over most magical law enforcement agencies. The enforced inactivity was particularly frustrating for young men whose entire adult identity had been built around productive work and creative achievement. The out-order business they conducted from Muriel's house was both practical necessity for maintaining some income and psychological requirement for preserving their sense of purpose during circumstances that might otherwise have led to depression or despair about their ability to contribute meaningfully to either their own welfare or the broader resistance effort. Their aunt's complaints about their activities were both understandable reactions to household disruption and evidence of generational differences about appropriate responses to political crisis. The Potter Watch radio broadcasts that Fred participated in were both important morale-building activities for the resistance and opportunities to use his natural humor as weapon against despair that threatened to overwhelm people who were struggling to maintain hope during times when defeat seemed increasingly likely. His jokes about rumored Voldemort capabilities served both entertainment and educational purposes, helping listeners distinguish between legitimate concerns and panic-inducing misinformation. The humor he brought to these broadcasts was carefully calibrated to provide relief without minimizing genuine dangers, understanding that inappropriate levity could undermine the credibility that Potterwatch required to serve its function as reliable information source for people who had no access to trustworthy news through official channels. His final joke about distinguishing between Voldemort and a basilisk through leg counting was both absurd comedy and practical advice about not believing every rumor that circulated during wartime. The revelation that Ron had been spotted with Harry created immediate danger for their family while providing hope that the mission to destroy Voldemort's Horcruxes was progressing despite the obstacles and setbacks that had characterized the early stages of that crucial operation. The decision to go into deeper hiding was both practical security measure and acknowledgement that their visibility made them liability for other Order members who might be targeted because of their associations. The closure of their shop represented both financial loss and symbolic defeat, though their determination to maintain some business operations despite the circumstances showed their refusal to abandon completely the dreams and achievements that had defined their adult lives. The joke shop that had been their pride and joy became another casualty of the war that was consuming everything they had worked to build and protect. The Battle of Hogwarts that brought them back to their former school was both homecoming and final examination, testing every skill they had developed and every lesson they had learned during their years of education and subsequent experiences in the wider magical world. Their arrival with Lee Jordan created the kind of reunion that was both joyful and terrifying, knowing that many of the people they cared about would not survive the night that lay ahead. The presence of Ginny among the fighters created immediate family conflict as misses. Weasley's protective instincts clashed with the reality that their sister was no longer a child who could be shielded from the consequences of adult decisions, though Fred and George's shame at bringing her into danger reflected their own continued struggle to balance protective impulses with respect for her autonomy and courage. The acknowledgement that they had made a mistake showed their ability to recognize when good intentions had led to poor judgment. Percy's return to the family was both emotional healing and tactical advantage, as his knowledge of ministry operations and his genuine remorse for his previous choices made him valuable ally whose presence helped restore family unity at a time when such solidarity was essential for psychological survival during the battle ahead. Fred's initial hostility gave way to genuine forgiveness as he understood that their brother's mistakes had been motivated by misguided loyalty rather than malicious intent. The joke that Percy made during their reconciliation was both unprecedented behavior and sign that the crisis had changed him in fundamental ways. Though Fred's response that he hadn't heard Percy joke since childhood was interrupted by the explosion that would end his life before he could complete his observation about their brother's personality transformation. The wall beside them erupted with force that was both random destruction and targeted attack. The death that claimed Fred was instantaneous and complete, leaving no opportunity for final words or conscious awareness of what was happening, though his final expression retained the ghost of his last laugh, in ways that suggested his essential nature had been preserved even in death. Percy's immediate response was to shield his brother's body from further harm, while processing the reality that someone so vital and creative had been permanently silenced by violence that served no purpose beyond destruction. The vigil that Percy maintained over Fred's body was both practical protection and emotional necessity, refusing to abandon his brother, even when tactical considerations suggested that continued fighting was more important than guarding the dead. Though Harry's eventual assistance in moving the body to safety allowed Percy to participate in the battle's conclusion, while ensuring that Fred received the dignity that his sacrifice deserved. The transportation of Fred's body to the Great Hall where other casualties were gathered was both logistical necessity and ritual acknowledgement of his contribution to the victory that his death had helped to achieve. Though the sight of his lifeless form among the other fallen fighters was a devastating reminder of the cost that freedom had exacted from people who had volunteered to pay prices they could not fully anticipate when they made their commitment to the cause. George's grief, as he sat beside his twin brother's body, was both personal devastation and existential crisis, as the loss of his lifetime partner challenged his understanding of his own identity and purpose in ways that could never be fully resolved through normal healing processes. The tears that fell down his face were both expression of immediate sorrow and recognition that his future would be fundamentally different from anything he had imagined during their years of shared dreams and mutual support. The continuation of the battle after Fred's death was both tribute to his memory and practical necessity for ensuring that his sacrifice would contribute to ultimate victory rather than meaningless loss. Though George's increased intensity during the final phases of fighting was motivated by grief-driven fury that transformed sorrow into weapon against the enemies who had taken his brother's life. His partnership with Lee Jordan in defeating Yaxley was both tactical cooperation and emotional catharsis. The final confrontation between Harry and Voldemort was witnessed by George among the survivors who gathered to see the conclusion of the conflict that had defined their entire adult lives. Though his attention was divided between the historic moment and the permanent absence of the person who should have been standing beside him to share both triumph and mourning for what the victory had cost them all. The silence that followed Voldemort's death was both celebration and devastation, marking the end of active hostilities, while beginning the long process of mourning for losses that could never be recovered or adequately compensated through victory alone. George's survival of the battle was both blessing and burden, as he faced the challenge of continuing to live in a world where his most important relationship had been permanently severed through violence that had been both random and inevitable given their choices about how to spend their lives. The silence that followed Voldemort's defeat was not the peaceful quiet that might have been expected after so long and terrible a war, but rather the hollow stillness that comes when something essential has been torn away from the world, leaving an absence so profound that even victory felt incomplete and somehow wrong. For George Weasley, sitting in the Great Hall, among the survivors while his twin brother's body lay motionless nearby. The end of the conflict brought not relief, but the crushing realization that the future he had always imagined, sharing with Fred, would now have to be navigated alone, through territories of grief and solitude that no amount of magical knowledge or creative ingenuity could transform into familiar ground. The days that followed the battle passed in a haze of funeral arrangements and family gatherings that felt both surreal and unbearably concrete, as the Weasley clan struggled to process their loss, while the wizarding world celebrated around them with the kind of exuberant joy that survivors feel when immediate danger has passed. The contrast between public celebration and private mourning created additional emotional complications for George, who found himself resenting the happiness of people who had not paid the prices that his family had been required to sacrifice for the victory that everyone was now free to enjoy. Fred's funeral was both tribute to his life and acknowledgement that some forms of loss could never be adequately addressed through ceremony or communal grief, though the gathering of friends and family who came to honor his memory provided George with evidence of how many lives his brother had touched through his humor, creativity, and generous spirit. The stories that were shared about Fred's pranks and kindness painted a portrait of someone whose impact on the world had extended far beyond his immediate family and business associates to encompass a network of people who had been made happier and more hopeful by his presence in their lives. But even as George listened to these testimonials and felt gratitude for the love that surrounded his family during their time of mourning, he struggled with the fundamental impossibility of imagining a future without the person who had been his constant companion, collaborator, and closest friend throughout every significant experience of his life. The prospect of returning to work at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes without Fred felt not just lonely but somehow fraudulent, as if he would be impersonating both members of their partnership rather than genuinely continuing their shared enterprise. The shop itself had survived the war physically intact, though the magical atmosphere that had made it special seemed diminished by Fred's absence in ways that went beyond simple nostalgia or temporary grief. The products they had developed together remained as innovative and entertaining as ever, but the creative process that had generated them was now fundamentally altered by the loss of half the partnership that had made their collaborations so effective and enjoyable. George found himself completing Fred's sentences in empty rooms, then experiencing the renewed shock of remembering that no one was there to respond to his observations or build upon his ideas. The financial success of their business provided both blessing and burden during this period, as the substantial profits they had accumulated before the war ensured that George would not face immediate economic pressures while he processed his grief and decided how to proceed with his life. But the money also represented dreams and plans that had been made for two people, creating uncomfortable reminders of conversations about expansion, new product lines, and long-term goals that now felt like artifacts from a life that had ended as completely as if he too had died in the battle. Ron's offer to help run the shop was both generous gesture and practical recognition that George needed support during his transition from partnership to solitary operation. Though their working relationship was complicated by Ron's lack of experience with the technical aspects of their manufacturing processes and his natural tendency toward the kind of well-intentioned clumsiness that could be dangerous when dealing with experimental magical products. His presence in the shop provided companionship that was genuinely helpful, but it also highlighted Fred's absence in ways that were sometimes more painful than solitude would have been. The customers who visited Weasley's Wizard Wheezes during the months following the war brought with them a mixture of condolences and expectations that created additional emotional challenges for George, who found himself simultaneously grateful for their sympathy and frustrated by their assumption that he could simply continue as before despite the fundamental changes in his circumstances. Many visitors seemed to expect that Fred's death would somehow enhance the business's reputation, rather than acknowledging that it represented an irreplaceable loss of creative talent and personal energy. The new products that George developed during this period reflected both his determination to honor Fred's memory and his struggle to find his own voice as a solo inventor, though the creative process was inevitably different when filtered through individual rather than collaborative thinking. Some innovations were clearly inferior to their previous work, lacking the spontaneous brilliance that had emerged from their ability to build upon each other's ideas in real time, while others showed unexpected depths of individual creativity that had perhaps been obscured during their years of constant partnership. The healing process was gradual and incomplete, marked by moments of devastating grief, alternating with periods of tentative hope about the possibility of building a meaningful life, despite the permanent absence of the person who had shared every significant experience since before birth. George discovered that mourning was not a linear progression from sorrow to acceptance, but rather a cyclical experience that revisited the same emotional territories repeatedly, though with gradually diminishing intensity as time provided perspective on losses that had initially seemed too overwhelming to survive. The relationship that developed between George and Angelina Johnson was both natural evolution of their existing friendship and conscious choice to create new sources of meaning and connection in lives that had been disrupted by trauma and loss. Angelina's own grief over Fred's death created a foundation of shared understanding that made their romantic relationship feel like collaboration in healing rather than betrayal of the past. Though George struggled with guilt about finding happiness in circumstances that Fred would never be able to share or enjoy, their courtship was conducted with the kind of careful tenderness that characterizes relationships between people who have experienced profound loss and understand the fragility of happiness, though it was also marked by moments of joy and laughter that felt like gifts from a universe that had seemed entirely hostile during the darkest periods following Fred's death. Angelina's patience with George's grief and her own genuine affection for Fred's memory made her an ideal partner for someone who needed to integrate mourning with the possibility of future happiness. The wedding that eventually united George and Angelina was both celebration of their love and memorial service for Fred, whose presence was acknowledged through empty chairs, shared memories, and the kind of bittersweet recognition that accompanies all significant life events for people who have lost someone essential to their understanding of family and community. The ceremony was smaller and more intimate than might have been expected during peacetime, reflecting both their desire for privacy and the continuing impact of wartime losses on everyone who had survived the conflict. The birth of their first child, whom they named Fred Weasley II in honor of his uncle, was both joyful occasion and emotionally complex experience that brought George face to face with the reality that life would continue and grow, even in the absence of people who should have been present to share in these moments of celebration and wonder. Holding his son for the first time was both overwhelming happiness and acute awareness of the grandfather who would never meet this new member of their family. Young Fred's resemblance to his namesake was both blessing and source of ongoing grief, as George found himself seeing his brother's expressions and mannerisms in his son's developing personality, creating moments of startling recognition that were simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. The child's laughter was particularly difficult for George to hear without remembering the sound of Fred's voice and the jokes they would never again share together. The daughter who followed, named Roxanne for reasons that George never fully explained, but which seemed to represent his desire to create new family traditions rather than simply repeating patterns from the past, brought additional joy to their household while helping to establish their family identity as something distinct from, but connected to the larger Weasley clan. Her personality was entirely her own, free from the burden of resembling lost relatives and able to develop without the weight of memorial expectations. The business that George had inherited and transformed continued to thrive under his solo management, though its character had evolved from the chaotic creativity that had characterized the original partnership into something more methodical and perhaps less spontaneous. The products were still innovative and entertaining, but they reflected individual rather than collaborative vision, showing different strengths and limitations than the items that had emerged from Fred and George's combined imagination and technical skill. The employees who worked at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes during this period learned to recognize the difference between George's good days and difficult ones, adjusting their approaches accordingly, while maintaining the kind of respectful distance that allowed him to process his emotions without feeling observed or judged by people whose understanding of his situation was necessarily limited by their own experiences with loss and grief. The 2014 Quidditch World Cup that George attended with his family was both return to normal recreational activities and test of his ability to enjoy experiences that he had previously shared with Fred, though the presence of his wife and children provided new contexts for creating memories that were not overshadowed by comparisons with the past. Young Fred's excitement about the matches and Roxanne's questions about the game created opportunities for George to see familiar activities through fresh eyes, while building new traditions for his own family. Rita Skeeter's article that mentioned George and his family during their World Cup attendance was both recognition of his business success and reminder of his public identity as the surviving member of a famous partnership, though her description of him as one-eared co-owner was typically tactless reference to his war injury, rather than respectful acknowledgement of his achievements as an individual entrepreneur and family man. The show of family togetherness that Skeeter attributed to their World Cup outing was accurate observation despite her cynical tone, as George had indeed worked consciously to create the kind of stable and loving family environment that would provide his children with security and happiness, while honoring the memory of the uncle they would know only through stories and photographs. The hole in George's heart that Fred's death had created never fully healed, remaining as a permanent reminder of what had been lost, while serving also as motivation for creating meaning and joy in the life that remained to be lived. The pain became more manageable over time, transforming from acute grief into chronic sadness that was balanced by genuine appreciation for the blessings that still existed in his world. The success of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes as a continuing enterprise provided both financial security and evidence that Fred's creative legacy would endure through the products they had developed together and the new innovations that George continued to produce in his memory. The shop remained a place where people could find laughter and wonder, serving customers who needed reminders that joy was possible, even in a world that contained loss and disappointment. The relationship that George maintained with his extended family was both source of comfort and occasional trigger for renewed grief, as family gatherings inevitably included references to Fred and memories of times when their partnership had been central to the group dynamic. His siblings' efforts to be supportive were generally helpful, though their own processes of mourning sometimes conflicted with his needs for space or different approaches to remembering their lost brother. The charitable work that George began during his middle years was both practical application of his financial resources and attempt to create positive impact that would honor Fred's memory, while contributing to causes that reflected their shared values about helping people and opposing injustice. The scholarships he established for students from disadvantaged backgrounds were designed to provide opportunities for creativity and innovation that might otherwise have been stifled by economic limitations. The mentorship he provided to young entrepreneurs who were developing their own magical businesses was both sharing of practical knowledge and way of ensuring that the kind of creative risk-taking that he and Fred had represented would continue to flourish in the wizarding world's commercial sector. His advice to these aspiring inventors emphasized both the importance of technical competence and the value of maintaining ethical standards in business practices. The gradual acceptance that George achieved regarding his brother's death was not resignation or forgetting, but rather integration of loss into a life philosophy that acknowledged both the reality of grief and the possibility of meaning and joy despite permanent absence of someone essential to his identity and happiness. He learned to carry Fred's memory as inspiration rather than burden, using their shared experiences as foundation for continued growth and contribution rather than reason for withdrawal from engagement with the world. The legacy that Fred and George Weasley had created together continued to influence the wizarding world long after Fred's death through their products, their business model, their approach to combining entertainment with technical innovation, and their demonstration that creative partnerships could achieve results that exceeded the sum of individual capabilities. Their story became part of the cultural mythology that surrounded the war against Voldemort, representing the kind of courage and sacrifice that had made victory possible. The laughter that Fred had brought to the world continued to echo through George's ongoing work and through the memories of everyone whose lives had been touched by his humor and generosity, ensuring that his death had not silenced his voice, but had rather transformed it into something that could not be destroyed by violence or time. The jokes continued to spread, the pranks continued to inspire new generations of mischief makers, and the fundamental message that joy was both possible and necessary continued to reach people who needed reminding that light could exist alongside darkness. The peace that George eventually found was not the absence of grief, but the presence of hope and purpose that could coexist with permanent loss, creating a life that honored both the past he had shared with Fred and the future he was building with his own family. The hole in his heart remained, but it was surrounded by love and meaning that made continued existence not just bearable but valuable, both for himself and for the people whose lives he continued to touch through his work and relationships. The wizarding world that emerged from the war was different in fundamental ways from the one that Fred and George had grown up in, but the need for laughter and creative expression remained constant, ensuring that their contributions would continue to be relevant and appreciated by people who faced new challenges but still required the same basic human experiences of joy and wonder that their products had been designed to provide. Rest now, gentle dreamer, as our tale of twin souls draws to its peaceful close. In the quiet hours of this magical night, let yourself be comforted by the memory of laughter that echoed through Hogwarts corridors, of two hearts that beat as one, and of love that transcended even death itself. Fred and George Weasley showed us that joy could flourish in the darkest times, that mischief could be a form of magic, and that the bonds between siblings could withstand any force, even the ultimate separation. As you drift toward dreams, remember that true magic isn't found in the grandest spells or the most powerful potions, but in the simple act of making someone smile when they need it most. The twins' greatest enchantment was their ability to find light in darkness and share it freely with all who needed it. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the magical world, laughter still echoes where Fred and George once walked. And in your dreams, may you find the courage to bring a little mischief and a lot of joy into tomorrow's adventures. Sweet dreams, and remember, mischief managed.